Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Occult Explorers. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined today by my good friend Gunk Wretch, and we're here to talk about Anarchy, part 2 of our series on Anarchia. Our good friend Dion will be joining us shortly, but thank you for joining me, Wretch. How's it going?
Great. I'm glad to be here. Had a lot of fun last time.
Exactly. Last time was such an amazing talk. We were just ranting and riffing. Dion had a great presentation. It was such a good time, and I'm so excited to have you back. So last time we were leaving off, we had kind of touched on sort of Max Stirner, the spooks. We talked about Eliphas Levi a little bit, and you had kind of teased our audience about getting into this, and as well as sort of expanding upon sort of the general conception of anarchism through the occult lens. How would you describe like arcanism and magic? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, philosophically, it's pretty endless, depending on how traditional you want to be. But the thing is about magicians is that they are prone to innovating or creating their own individual path. And so magic is a kind of spiritual anarchism or ontological anarchism, it's been called. So as I see it, spirituality should be each individual's work of art as they try to understand reality. And after a certain point, science is great, but after a certain point, when it comes to consciousness, we have to resort to symbols and metaphors, and through this means we can expand our consciousness, and entheogens help, and entheogens can create states of consciousness which are beyond words, especially
one of the things,
ritual and meditation.
Right. One of the things I think that many people who aren't practiced in the magical tradition fail to recognize is that so much of magical practice is about this kind of cultivation of the self, this return to the body, and this recognition of the body and a synthesis with the body, a harmonizing with the body. So much of that adage, as above, so below, you could, instead of seeing it through that philosophical lens, you can see it through the intimate lens of the body. As an individual in an absurd reality, I perceive the universe through the metaphor of the human as a human, and therefore everything is humanistic. And these images and frameworks allow us to adapt and perceive and engage reality from an informed lens. And using these lenses is, in a way, going back to the root of the self, going back to the body, right?
Yes. Well, to me, the most magical philosophies tend to be non-dual in nature. And so it's not... In order to do that, you have to accept your body for sure. And you might be overcoming your desires because they are a distraction from your true will. But in order to do that, you can't just repress them. You have to actually face them and integrate them and experience them, as many would say, over a transmigration of the soul through reincarnation. This can take many lifetimes. So as Hermeticism explains, we are incarnate because we want to be incarnate. We desire material things. And so only until we've overcome those material desires through experiencing them can we transcend or go back to the heaven that we fell from. We are all the fallen angels in Hermeticism.
Can we break down this idea of Hermeticism a bit? First, taking it back to the idea of Hermes as sort of the primordial concept of the man become deity. and what this is in the magical tradition?
Yeah, but before we do that, let's just define anarchism a little bit more clearly for the audience. Um,
Absolutely.
so
Hi, Dion.
anarchism is opposed to both. Oh, is it?
Dion just hopped in, just in
Hey,
case you weren't,
Dion.
you didn't notice.
Great to see you, Dion. So we're just going to define anarchism quickly and then explain its relation to Hermeticism and non-dualism generally. Okay, so anarchism is opposed to both the state and capitalism. It's against all imposed hierarchies. And it argues that freedom is best maximized when we can make collective decisions. Whenever somebody is affected by a decision, they should have a say in that decision. And so there are many ways of building consensus according to the people who are involved. They can choose their method of anarchism. There's many types of anarchism. We touched on libertarian communism last time, or anarcho-communism,
We
because
also talked about egoism and Stirner, right?
right. So there's
Though that's a
so
limiting word. I shouldn't use that for him.
then there's anarcho-syndicalism, which is more of a tactic to bring about the fuller form of anarchism, as because we live in a capitalist society. We can't just fighting a revolution to impose anarchism on everybody is nonsensical. That wouldn't work. You'd have to form, that would be socialism. So anarcho-syndicalism is the idea that we should have worker-owned co-ops and unionize as with the International Workers of the World, the IWW, and try to politically build up our strength to build consensus that this collective worker society can exist. Okay,
Are you
so
familiar with? Also, I just want to elucidate on that, or there's another kind of magical current of anarchy that you briefly touched on there, ontological anarchism. And one of the things that they've brought to this is the whole idea of temporary autonomous zones. Are you familiar with Hakim Bey and that idea of these collectives, these autonomous collectives arising in the moment and then rising to radical action? We see this realized in groups such as ELF and the ALF and other types of, anarchist movements. But he wanted to see this come to the point of even societies, autonomous societies arriving naturally.
yeah, I've read Taz. It's been more than a decade now, but I have read it, and he has some interesting points, despite his personal life or some of his other views. But yeah, it was very influential, and a lot of people don't realize how influential he was. But it certainly, I think it inspired Burning Man, for example.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I noticed when I was first getting into chaos magic and then talking to other magicians was how relative Hakim Bey is. Because everyone had an opinion, and a lot of people were upset with him, as you pointed out, and a lot of people liked a lot of his stuff too. Especially like in those early chaos zines, you'll see like the most intense debates, and that's something I'm going to get up to in my presentation between the people who are following more of a Genesis Peorage style of chaos magic along the lines of the Temple of Psychic Youth, and this belief in chaos as this kind of that radical nothing and absolute potential. And then Hakim Bey, Peter Langborn Wilson, seems to have this idea of the chaos is conflated with the good that really rubs people the wrong way. And that good, becomes a sort of kind of elitism in some aspects of his philosophy.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that he's intimately aware with Max Stirner.
Mm.
But anyways, for now, so as we explained in the last video, black magic can be defined as imposing your will on other people, setting up hierarchies, or going against anarchism. The universe is essentially anarchist. the one force, depending on which paradigm or tradition you're working in, the ultimate reality is pretty anarchist in a lot of cases. So black magic is imposing hierarchies, including theocracies, on people. And that would be including capitalism. As Adam Smith said, the hidden hand of the market is God himself. So it's a very theocratic, faith-based kind of economy that's, well, it's based on confidence in the market, in the dollar, etc. And it's imposed through terrorism.
Absolutely.
So we still want to enjoy natural pleasures, and there's nothing wrong with that in a non-dual philosophy. As I said with Hermeticism, we have to experience our pleasures so that we can get over them and then transcend to the heavens. So Hermes was quite, maybe it's not totally compatible, but there's a lot of food for thought there for anarchists. And so, for example, and this is largely ignored in most books you'll read, but if you read the primary text carefully, you'll see more what I mean. But as we can read in the text Cor Cosmu, Aphrodite actually gave desire to humanity as a gift. And so desire is not evil. Aphrodite is not evil here. And Eros also turns up in the Hermetic text, as do the Muses and a variety of interesting Greek things, though it's more generally an Egyptian mysticism. By the time it was written down of these texts, the Hermes and Thoth were so blended that it's hard to sort them out sometimes. So let me just read a little bit from Cor Cosmu on desire and wisdom, and how, yeah, we have desire, but it's going to be unsatisfying. All material pleasures are ultimately unsatisfying compared to union with the universe or transcendence in heaven. So by experiencing our limited desires, the material plane, we make mistakes, and we grow in wisdom, and that is ultimately the point of us being here. Okay? So desire is not evil. It makes our time as mortals bearable. It's actually a respite from our exile here in the material world. So
it's one of these interesting things, because Eros, right? I always think of Eros, especially in the terms of like the pagan tradition that you see in the later Germanic works, that's building off of Hermeticism, where Eros becomes, as seen in that Orphic lens as well, that cosmogonic force, the gadfly that spurs Phanes to rip itself apart. And it's that primal energy of lust and desire, but also it's that energy that can ultimately lead to ecstasis, that can lead to that transcendent bliss that leads one to achieve ionic self and realization. And this is the grand gift of Aphrodite, that our desire for life and the pursuit and the unfolding of life and going through the cycles is ultimately what leads you to transcendence, right?
Right. So by experimenting with our desires, we ultimately come to our true will, which is beyond the ego, our desire for union with all of nature and reality, and to have wisdom. So in truth, humans, and psychology shows this pretty clearly too. Humans are much more emotional than we like to think in the West, and we tend to believe what we want to believe and then rationalize it, rather than coming to a rational conclusion starting from a place free of desire. We're all subject to wishful thinking So the only way to overcome that is to overcome worldly desires, and the only way to overcome your desires is to experience them fully and overcome your
Absolutely.
shadow and repression. And then you will
Absolutely.
authentically want virtue and rationality and become capable of those things, because you experience what happens when you ignore those things.
Right?
So
Like, I really love this idea of Hermes as the archetypical one who faces the devil, Apollo. He masters Apollo. He's able to get the power of the caduceus in exchange for the lute or the lyre, sorry. But then this allows him, he has that magic of will. He can now project his energy across time and manifest his desire, right? He has that masculine phallus, right?
yeah, so that's a very Greek one. But okay, so let me just read a little bit from the Hermetic text Kore Cosmu, the Virgin of the World, which refers to the teachings of the Virgin Isis to her son Horus. Okay, so the following is context is that humanity, or at least the bodies of humanity, are being created, and Momos, the god of blame, serves as a kind of accuser like Satan, and suggests to Hermes that we humans will have it too easy. So I quote, uh, Momos is talking, teach them, humanity, then, to have a passion for their projects, so that they fear the bleakness of their failure, so that they are tamed by biting grief when they fail to obtain their hopes. Let the niggling curiosity of their souls be cut down by lusts, fears, waves of grief, and deceitful hopes. Let continual love affairs take vengeance upon their souls, along with varied hopes and desires, sometimes fulfilled, sometimes shattered, so that the sweet bait of success becomes a striving for more perfect evils. Let them be weighted down with fevers, so that they, when they lose heart, chastise their desire. Isis says, are you sad, Horus, my son, as your mother interprets these things for you? Do you not wonder or stand dumbfounded when you see pitiful humanity weighed down? Hear now what is more terrible. Hermes took pleasure in the speech of blame, for he spoke what suited him. He performed exactly what blame, Momos, had advised, remarking, very well, Momos, the all-encompassing nature of divine breath will no longer be clearly visible. After all, the master of all has declared that I be steward and foreseer. The sharp-sighted goddess Nemesis will be appointed as overseer of the universe. As for me, I will devise a secret mechanism maintaining unerring and inviolable scrutiny. To it, all things on earth will be necessarily be enslaved from birth to their final decay. This mechanism maintains the fixity of what must be completed. All other things on earth will obey it. So, end quote. So Hermes is setting up this kind of system of karma or meritocracy, but it's not like capitalism. It's a real meritocracy based on how virtuous we are and how much we will irrational and ignorant things. David Litwood, the translator, provides the following citation for reference. Quote, compare Aeschylus, and he quotes, Zeus has established as a fixed law that wisdom comes by suffering, but even as trouble, bringing memory of pain, drips over the mind in sleep, so wisdom comes to men whether they want it or not. So, so we're here to, that's.
I was going to say this really, from a more Greek lens, it makes me think of a very similar is the Platonic story of Attis, especially the iteration we see in the writings of Emperor Julian, where Attis, he's overcome by the beauty of the world and he falls down from the heavens and rejects the mother, only to fall into the waters chasing after the nymphs, only to never catch them and find himself bound in the mud. And then, when bound in the mud, he cries out in desperation. The mother hears him, sends the beast, who causes him to go into that madness. It's the gadfly Eros energy, and he castrates himself. And this is both a literal and a symbolic castration, as a form of divine imitation of the mother and a rejection of the desire that brought him low. And then he goes through that process of divine imitation and rises upon the back of the beast and ascends to the stars. And by the end, you see him in complete imitation of the mother, and him and Cybele are one and the same.
Yeah, that's a beautiful text. And a variety of Neoplatonists were influenced by Hermeticism. But this is at home with, to a certain degree, even with Plato, who is also said to have studied Hermes in Egypt or whatever. So a lot depends on how much you want to believe that. But anyway, Plotinus Enneads has it in its own way as Aphrodite is the world soul. Each of our souls is a portion of Aphrodite and female, and she gives birth to Eros, which is our love for the rest of the world soul. So each individual soul, Aphrodite, gives birth to our Eros, which is individual and must be expressed in individual terms towards the world soul in the universe. And by following that Eros, we can return back to the world soul. So, and if you don't bring forth what is within you authentically, you will be destroyed by it. So you have to integrate your shadow. And
this also makes me think of a lot of the tantrika stuff, especially in the marriage of Parvati and Shiva, where so much of that is about awakening Shiva from his egoic isolation and recognizing the beauty of nature and seeing himself reflected in the Darpana, Parvati's mirror, and coming to see her and himself as one and the same, right? And then he achieves that greater realization even still, where they become the cosmic dancer, Nataraj, capable of new creation.
Yeah, Tantra is very compatible with Hermeticism in particular, and there might even be a historical link, which we can go into some other time. But, parts of Hermeticism, like I just read, might sound a bit authoritarian if taken out of context. It's hard to give you the full context. But let me just read a little bit more from the Kore Cosmu, where we learn, quote, Venus is giving the gift of desire, so that you see that, Momos intended it as a punishment, or he wanted to kind of screw over humanity, but it's still a gift. So, quote, Venus asserted without hesitation, to them, Master, I will yoke desire, pleasure, and laughter, so that the souls akin to me who suffer the most horrid condemnation might not be punished beyond measure. God was greatly pleased, my child, when Venus said this. And in another part, we read, the souls, Horus, my son, succeeded in their petition. The soul ruler came, sat on the throne of truth, and answered their supplications. O souls, Eros and necessity will be your masters, for they, after me, are the masters and chief directors of all. As for you, souls who serve my ageless royal scepter, know that as long as you do not err, you will dwell in heavenly realms. Yet if blame attaches to one of you, you will dwell condemned in mortal guts as your allotted realm. Those of you who blame is not severe will break free of the baleful bond of flesh, and once again, without groans, create your own heaven. Yet if you are workers of greater sins, you will not advance from the molded body when your due service is paid. You will not dwell in heaven, not even in human bodies. You will complete the rest of your lives wandering in the bodies of non-reasoning beasts. End quote. So there you see that if we figure out our true will, we will transcend the material world and go to our own heaven. We have our own individual heavens. well, there might be other souls like us there, according to sympathetic magic, let's say, we would say. So the idea is that we fell in the first place because we weren't content in heaven and we desired material pleasures. And so we have all of these irrational desires, which is why we're in human bodies. And so our lives is kind of like a calibration to find our true will. We have to experience ignorance so that we and these ignorant pleasures so that we can figure out what our real priorities are, and then go to our real heaven, in which case we're going to stop reincarnating because we're satisfied for eternity. So all of this world is a way of finding our true will.
Wow, I absolutely love that. So, Dion, what do you think of all this? What's been going on with you? What are your thoughts on Hermeticism and anarchy?
Oh, I love it. I love what Wretch put forth there. You said a couple interesting words. One was temporary autonomous zone, which I find very interesting. If people have any that know about that, one example could be in Seattle with Antifa, what they tried to set up there. People will talk about that. It wasn't too big. It was just a couple blocks, but on TV, it seemed like they took over half the city.
Right. We saw that also famously during the Wall Street protests in New York, but they quickly got compromised, by far right agitators. But they did have it for a little moment.
Yeah. And even recently in LA, when the city was burning down and they took it over, I still went to work that same day. Everything was normal. All that was contained within 2 or 3 blocks. There was more news and media surrounding it and police. Let's
People
say
keep waiting for the world to end and for these intense moments to affect their lives, and they fail to recognize like people are still going to work today in Ukraine, right? Like the life has to go on. Life is a perpetual struggle. Like, there isn't going to be this tipping moment that everyone's waiting for. This is part of the problem with modernity and the need for revolution, right? But I wanted to show you guys this really awesome quote because it really backs up what Wretch has been sharing and proving and showing us with Hermeticism. So this comes to us. Oops, let me just remove this. This comes to us from a book called Occult Features of Anarchism by Erica Lagalize and Barbara Ehrenreich. And it says, modern anarchism has never been purely atheist except in name, and instead develops based on overlapping syncretic pagan cosmologies that behold the immanence of the divine. In fact, utopian socialism, anarchism, and Marxism each rely on a specific syncretic cosmology that is incipient in the Middle Ages, changing and crystallizing in the Renaissance, and gradually given a scientific makeover throughout the Enlightenment up to the 20th century. So what are your thoughts upon this, guys?
Yeah, well, she lays it out very clearly there. There has always been people who wanted to live free, okay, in any time and place. There were people who loved freedom and who opposed tyranny. So the black magicians want you to feel like freedom never existed. That's why they invented the noble lie of Plato, or used that in Christianity, etc. So they want you to believe there never was a time of freedom and that it's impossible. Don't even want it, just want to submit to the hierarchies. That's what they're trying to steer consensus reality towards, because
the best you can hope for is to be one of the 144,000 chosen, right? That's your best you can hope for, is to be one of the worshipers at the top.
The most ignorant desire that I can think of is to want to be a ruler over other people and to enslave other people, or to be a black magician. So there are those souls here that are the most ignorant that want to do that. But we have to learn why we want to oppose them, why anarchism is necessary. And you know what? Even if the whole world is not capable of anarchism, that doesn't mean you shouldn't want it as an individual, or that you aren't capable of becoming freer, or that you aren't capable of mutual aid networks and improving your lives through creating real communities. So this is pretty inherent to anarchism. And there are, but that Hermetic idea of finding your true will seems to have influenced Crowley, though he also learned from Tantra and other things. His idea of true will is not purely, and Rabelais. There's many sources, no doubt, but Rabelais was probably knew about
Greek
Hermes as well. So
yeah.
So he's not really talking about the desires of the ego so much, or the Gnostics also had a similar idea of this, and they taught that a soul must experience all things, and that, like, say, the Cainites, for example, would purposely sin and then ask for forgiveness to demonstrate the absolute mercy of God or Jesus, or so. They would purposely sin in all kinds of ways to demonstrate this, and to overcome their desires. They would engage in tantric-like practices and thereby exercise archon spooks, personifications of vices, or the ghosts of the Nephilim, as I will explain. So, but for paganism within modern anarchism, let me just point out that Mikhail Bakunin was a Freemason, though he's an atheist. I still love him dearly. Proudhon and Pierre Proudhon, it's a very important anarchist, and Peter Kropotkin were likely Masons as well, but it's impossible to verify this. As you might expect, these are secret networks who were mostly united by their hatred. The Freemasons were mostly united by opposition to Catholicism, but they could have any number of politics. The fact is that Freemason attracted all kinds of people in radical politics, depending on the time, but generally opposed to Catholicism. Peter Kropotkin has a whole theory of mutual aid, which is particularly pagan, and it's basically an anarchist Gaia theory. He argues, and this is right around, like, soon after Darwin, so he's arguing that humans and animals in general, or the ecosystem in general, evolved for symbiosis, which he relates to mutual aid. So that, and he talks about indigenous people, and was way ahead of his time. He basically invented the modern Gaia theory of James Lovelock, though I don't know that James Lovelock is an anarchist, but he anticipated that very much ahead of time. So Crowley was explicitly not an anarchist because he didn't like the Haymarket affair, or there was anarchist terrorists bombing people during his life, and he didn't like it. But if you read his text, Liber Oz, and another one called Duty, and understand the search for the true will, then you can see that anarchism is really the only political system that, or ideology that could really live up to Duty and Liber Oz.
Well, there's so many times that Crowley talks about this idea that, the law becomes corrupt, that anything that you codify into a law, it becomes about the code rather than the meaning. And ultimately it turns into this Apollonian ugliness. So he was all about this pursuit of the scientific reason in terms of morality, and using your morality in the moment through the power of nuance, right?
Yeah, so love is the law, love under will. Again, we can take similar ideas back to Orphism, as Phanes Eros is the first being he is pure desire for all things, and so eventually fell into time and matter, and we have to reascend back to him. Or as Dionysus was led astray by the toys of the Titans, that also signifies the fall into material illusions to experience pleasures and so forth. So we just got to play it out and get it out of our system in a rational way, but in an honest way and not in a repressed, dualistic way. So Christianity wants you to force asceticism on people. It wants to just repress your shadow and scare people into submission, which never really works. You know, maybe a few people naturally aren't that hedonistic and they're Christian or whatever, and so they're not as repressed as others. But if they're forcing that on everybody else, then it's totally theocratic black magic designed to destroy consciousness and free will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see this so much in the occult traditions, especially within Crowley's magic, this idea of the invocation of Pan, the experience of the all and the breaking of the taboo, the shattering of the laws as a way to experience the profound recognition of the unity. So much of our lives we are bound in fear because of these extreme prejudices. And it's not that these prejudices are necessarily wrong, but they are such. And you see this reflected in the Tantra as well, right? You know, Crowley was doing things like croprophilia, and he was doing things like invocation of extreme pain. But, you know, you see in the Tantras the breaking of taboo of the consumption of meat or the association with dead bodies. But all of this is, or even you get this later with occultists and philosophers like George Bataille, where they even celebrate this idea of suicide, right? Where there's this freedom in the absolute destruction of the self. And we even see this in the Greco-Roman pagan tradition through characters such as Astrea, who achieves apotheosis by setting herself ablaze on the pyre, or even Heracles, who doesn't transcend to godhood until he is poisoned and then set ablaze, you know?
Or there was that Indian guy who got initiated the Eleusinian mysteries, and he's like, well, that's it. I'm done. I can just kill myself now.
Right.
Now, that is not what I recommend.
No.
But it's a thing. And
that is a thing in the traditions.
So Crowley was not just pulling it out of his ass when he said, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And so just to provide a little bit more context as to Hermes as a non-dual anarchist type figure, he's also the god of thieves, or wealth redistribution, we could say, or illegalist anarchists, as the Homeric hymn to Hermes, you know, he was living in poverty in a cave, and so he took it upon himself to help his mother because he saw it wasn't fair that they have nothing. So there's a whole book called Hermes the Thief, and it explains that he was a god of wealth redistribution. It argues that before Hermes was the god of merchants, people just had common property, and to steal was just to take something not currently being used by others. So people would steal from each other, and in that way, things would go back and forth as no one owned it. This is not so different from the old anarchist adage, property is theft, as from Pierre Proudhon. Cattle was the original form of currency, and thieving only took on negative connotations after private property started, and foreign merchants removed the property from the commons. These merchants were also travelers, hence Hermes is a god of all of this. Hesiod was actually more in favor of this original form of community, whereas Hermes is said in this book to be mocked a bit by Homer, as in the hymn to Hermes and this cow-stealing myth. He was trying to encourage the new kind of economy. This is because over time the family clans which owned the commons became aristocratic, and the peasants were left out of the family communal property, so that mercantilism was welcomed among the lower classes as a means of social mobility. Also inspired by contact and learning from outsiders, which is a Hermes thing too, going around learning from everybody, considering all points of view. So while Hermes at this phase encouraged this mercantile economy, it actually helped to give power to the non-aristocrats, which eventually helped lead to democracy as opposed to the entrenched aristocracy that Hesiod was more in favor of. While the ancient cult of Hermes doesn't involve banks or usury in the same way, this is not so different from how capitalism came out of feudalism in Christian Europe and later inspired democratic movements like the revolutionaries in the US. The Greeks took far less time to get to democracy, though, and didn't mess about with feudalism so much. The Christians also had the Black Death, which killed so many people that there was a shortage of workers, and so the peasants could ask for better working conditions. As we can read in the book Caliban and the Witch, the plague created such a demand for workers that women were able to take jobs, so that capitalism was created to strengthen patriarchy and demonize such women who were labeled as witches. Though, of course, some of these were midwives, and I personally believe some were carrying on very ancient pagan traditions, the witch is definitely presented as an anarchist-like figure, or even punk rock, in ancient or medieval sources. There was definitely a medieval drug trade, but it was largely legal, and yet the pagan ritual use of drugs for pagans was, of course, legal. So there is a stream of antinomian mysticism or magic, which is typically involving entheogen use from ancient times. There was tyrannical people, there was anarchists or freedom-loving people throughout the history of civilization. So there was this class war ongoing or culture war ongoing, and you can kind of pick out what you want from it. But there was never a, total consensus about authoritarianism, that's for sure. Okay,
Yeah.
so with that context with that we get just a general, that Hermes the Thief book is really great for understanding Hermes as a more anarchist figure. He was the god of thieves, but he might also be called on to protect against thieves. And this, in terms of thieves, they might be connected to the werewolf cult, like Hermes' son Autolycus, which means self-wolf, literally. And there is signs of this werewolf cult all over the place. And there are common Indo-European tropes about all this. But Egypt definitely has this egalitarian idea. And it was the first, through the cult of Amun, which became Amon in Greek, we get the first mysticism, which says that everybody can potentially attain apotheosis. We can all become gods and ascend to the heavens and become a star. And this was this is central to the cult of Amun or Amun-Re, and was a big influence on Crowley as well. Every
Absolutely.
man is a star, he said. And then there's the Stele 666, which alludes to this, but it's just one example. He didn't just make that up. It is that might not, he said that was, he learned in
You see
Egypt.
this on many of the Egyptian, I'm trying to remember which one, but it's on the funeral. It's on several of these funeral texts that you see that are imprinted in many of these tombs, where they'll talk about how we hope that this person interred here will ascend to the stars. That's the intention.
It's all over. It's not an obscure thing if you learn about Amun-Re. Actually, this mysticism was behind the Egyptian revolution against the Hyksos and allowed them to defeat the foreign colonizers, the imperialists who had taken over Egypt. They kicked them out, and it led to a more egalitarian religion that Ramses the Great spread all over the place. He conquered all the way up to Turkey. And so he's actually one of the candidates that historians think might be this human figure, Sesostris, who Greek historians said was actually Helios, the grandfather of Medea. So it might be, there actually are records of pharaohs named Sesostris who are older than that. But Ramses the Great really did go up all the way to the Hittite Anatolia. So he is the best candidate for some fuzzy folk memory of Egyptians meeting with Scythians or becoming, being at the root of the Medea legend.
Absolutely. This is where the Libyan meets the Crimean aspects of her story.
So it all ties together pretty nicely, actually. And Medea would go around overthrowing kingdoms. Was very much a rebel and a feminist who did whatever the fuck she wanted. And so it's all very interesting. But
Medea, right? Her story begins with her rebelling against her mother and her father, only to get caught up with Jason and have to break free of him. But it's essential that her story begins with that initial rebellion. She says, "No, I'm not going to kill the foreigners. That's evil," right?
And so Hermeticism is tied to that, is a version of that cult of Amun-Re in the Greco-Roman times. But that revolution of Amun was very much tied to the city of Thebes and the Theban triad, and in which Thoth is very prominent. So it is connected. There is a common thread there historically. Now, as we are all sparks of the monad, or the unified field, or Amun, we're all part of the Ba of Amun, which is like, in a way, the force of Star Wars, or the Tao of Taoism. We are all doing magic constantly, whether we're conscious of it or not. So if we are delusional or have ignorant desires, we will create a delusional and ignorant reality. And the black magicians know that, which is why they're constantly trying to terrorize us into submission and to consenting to their authority. So Max Stirner was, to some degree, aware of this. It's hard to say exactly how much, but the more I read him, the more it seems like he was a magician anyway. And so he had this concept of spooks, which I brought up before. And just to reiterate, we can think of spooks as a straw man cultural construct, or an abstraction which people mistake for being an objective reality, or that can be defined objectively. If Socrates taught us anything, is that people don't know the definitions of the words they use. They think they do, but if you question them long enough, it becomes pretty clear very quickly that they don't actually know the definitions of words like justice or other key words on which we use to rationalize all the rest. So
Absolutely. Right. I think this is a really important point, right, that you're getting at with all of this kind of spook stuff and this disconnection and the psychic propaganda. And I wanted to bring up this aspect because when I was looking into this modern anarchist current within the occult, I found this essay that was talking about Hakim Bey and the conflict between him and Genesis Peorage. And they said that the uniting feature of all these chaos magicians, starting from Austin Osman Spar going down, but I think we can ultimately take it to Stirner and even further, is this idea of, well, let me read the quote here and you'll see. It says, basically, they all shared the belief that the experience of gnosis through magical techniques, rituals, and psychedelics revealed the anarchic, yet malleable interplay of the forces that structure reality. Additionally, it was believed that the structure of reality was actively obscured by the barrage of psychic propaganda, frequently identified in situationist language as the spectacle. The difference between the competing interpretations of chaos magic was in the course of action suggested by the Gnostic experiences of chaos. This connects everyone from Antonin Artaud to Hakim Bey to Genesis P-Orge to all of those desperate chaos kind of magical traditions. Peter Carroll, Robert Sherwin, all of these characters, right? And it even goes back further to Max Stirner. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so the root of black magic seems to be monotheism, dualism, and objectivism, the idea that you are born objective and can perceive reality totally accurately, and there are no illusions, and everybody knows good and evil, very clear cut, but some of us are just born evil, and so we choose to ignore it, or, we become so it can get more complicated, nuanced than that in like Kabbalah or mystical forms of the Abrahamic religions, but these are drawing off pagan philosophy heavily. And Max Stirner was aware of a lot of this, and he didn't like Plato either. Like, Plato's ideals can be, if you thought you had an objective view of the ideals that you can force them on everybody, that would be a spook for sure. But at the same time, Plato's cave, or his concept of eidolons as these distorted images on the lower astral realm, which we mistake for reality, or those are basically spooks. But actually, there's a great book by an author named Jacob Blumenfeld on Max Stirner as he relates to anarcho-communism specifically. And he also gives some historical context and explains that Max Stirner's spooks are based on this Stoic concept, phasmata, which might also be translated as phantasms, but are hallucinations. And Ammon has talked about them at some points in some of his episodes as well. So,
and this ultimately connects us to the Cynics. Like, if you're going to the Stoics, you have to take it to the Cynics, and we have to ultimately take it to Diogenes himself, who rejected the nomos, the law, and fundamentally he rejected the heights of the ideal. One of the Platonic concepts, right, is that, you can have an ideal man. And, Plato refused to accept that absolute ideal, right? Diogenes refused to accept that absolute ideal. And it's very clear that Stirner is building upon this. Like, ultimately, there is no thing. We are making it up as we go. And Stirner is very clear on this, as also is like later people like Hakim Bey and Genesis. Ultimately, there's nothing. You're building upon the abyss and you're constructing it all. And anything that you think is tangible and real is a creation of the mind.
Yeah, or it's chaos. It's all things and nothing simultaneous, beyond all dualities. And we can pick out from the infinite chaos which realities we want, which is the process of magic. And so Stirner, so having these abstractions or cultural constructs can be useful for communication, but only if we understand that we are defining them and they're subjective and hypothetical, and that they're models. And we have in science creates models to explain reality, but they should always be open to being updated as new information comes in, and they're always inherently limited within this infinite reality. So it requires humility to face that. And so Stirner had this general context. He definitely knew about the Greek philosophy in general. Okay, so now there is a type of spook called an egregore, which is personified, and I brought it up last episode. An egregore is a astral form that's personified, that is given a life of its own because it's imagined to have a life of its own. And so we can tie this to theurgy just briefly. A statue, through the process of animating a statue, you have to find the right symbols, or symbola they're called. And then, as Iamblichus explains, a daemon messenger in the image of the gods will inhabit that statue. Okay, so you can make the statue however you want, and you can animate it, and some daemon may inhabit it. If you have unvirtuous or irrational intentions, then it might be a lying daemon. It could be even one of the restless dead who's impersonating a god. And so keep that in mind as I talk about spooks or egregores.
You can see those those eidolons that become possessed by a spirit and then attack. This becomes a trope within the Greek magical tradition. We have several of these statues that fall over and crush people, and they're said to have their own will. You know, one of the things, if you don't do the rituals right, or if you spurn the image of the god, then you can be attacked. Sometimes the household Larry, the snake, would attack. And there was this whole idea, right? Like this image informs the body and the body informs the image, right? There's this intimate connection between the idol and the divine that's really, really important to this egregoric understanding. This is essential to, for example, in like Ludwig Klage's philosophy. He talks about this quite a bit at length as this way to show us that in the ancient world, right, it's not there. The body is enthused with the image, and the image allows the body to become alive. And we see this with the statues that take vengeance.
Yeah, well, so some of these daemons can become parasitic or vampiric, and they feed off worship and incense, but they don't really provide any. They don't really raise consciousness properly, for any number of reasons. So if you're not in line with your true will or trying to raise your consciousness, chances are will become enslaved to these spirits. Or if you don't understand your own magical abilities, you become dependent on these spirits to do your magic for you, and so you never develop your own abilities.
So I want to ask you about this, Dion, because I know this is something that you've talked about at length, but this idea where people get so caught up and radicalized, like we were talking about this the other day in terms of Sikhism and just a personal conversation where you see people become radicalized, militarized, and literally sacrifice themselves for the spirit of this eidolon that then continues to manifest and inspire others. It becomes this self-perpetuating force of consumption and perpetuating that doctrine, that ideology, whether it's communism or religion or any kind. Politics and religion seem the most apparent in our society. What do you think on this?
Well, these eidolons are hungry. I know people that are into voodoo, Santeria, all that different stuff. If you go to their house and have altars, and they'll have these statues that they'll set up, and each one of them has a different personality and requires food, some type of sustenance to animate it. And sometimes it's blood, and it's symbolic, but there's still an exchange of blood in real life, of sacrifices and goats and chickens and stuff to animate these things, or they believe it animates it. They believe that it changes their lives. These statue, I mean, that's the best word to say what it is. It's a statue because it's nothing, but it comes to life somehow in our minds, in our fantasy world, where it comes to life.
it's really interesting because when I look at the creation of the eidolon, this is such a powerful thing within the pagan tradition, right? This is the execution of the beautiful, the calling and the invocation of the deity, the drawing down of the moon. The creation of the image is the giving birth to new life and generation. It is seeing the spirit within the consciousness of the element you're working with, whether it is a stone or anything, right? At least that's how they're conceptualizing it in these theurgic traditions. But with the eidolons or with the egregores that like Stirner's talking about, this takes on something entirely different. This takes on this kind of war consuming monotheism. Like I feel like Christianity is sort of the prototypical egregore because it tells everyone to give up their own true self and to try to become idealized in the image of Jesus, right? What would Jesus do? And to identify with the sin, right? Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, the sinner. And so you're always in this sense of failure and striving after this ideal and submission to that ideal. And the egregore takes on this perfection to which everyone is constantly striving for and projecting all of their energy towards. And so
it's invisible at that.
Right?
Right.
Well, if I could say one thing, the reply to that would be the concept of folk magic as insurrection.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the thing that we can see all over. But I just want to clarify a little bit because Jesus is the prime example of this. As he died, the way he died, a violent death as a criminal, he would have been one of the restless dead or a cacodemon. And Christianity then is a form of necromancy, of working with the saints and martyrs who are cacodemons, and they infiltrate pagan temples and steal the worship of the gods. The Hermeticists explicitly accuse the Christians of this, as we can read in Augustine's City of God, where he tries to rebut them. The Hermetic text, Asclepius, the Perfect Sermon, he says, is actually an argument against Christianity. And it refers to these daemons who who are like incubus or succubus or Nephilim ghosts or the Watchers, somewhat, because they have sex with people, but they're also spreading illusions more than, like, the Book of Enoch is demonizing pagan religions in general, but in truth, the Christians were the ones doing this necromancy, black magic. So the teachings of Jesus is like, no, you don't need to integrate your shadow. No, you don't need to really achieve wisdom or raise your consciousness. Just believe in me, and I'll forgive you all your sins, and you'll get into the ion. You'll attain ionic life, and you will. So don't worry about all those other practices. Just have faith in me and obey the church, and pay your tithe.
By the time it becomes the religion of empire, and you get the codification of Christianity in Catholicism, you see this where it even becomes worse. What do? They say they weaponize it against the pagan other. All that is evil is pagan, and it becomes this profound act of salvation to go and destroy the pagan other, whether it's Muslim or one of these tribal or non, or polytheistic religions or Hermeticism or what have you, right? The Christian, one of the ways in which they empower themselves is this narcissism of small difference. They say, you're nothing like us, and we must destroy you because you're evil and sinful, and you won't submit to our absolute dogma.
Right. So, getting back to egregores, we can see this kind of philosophy of occult philosophy is at play right into the 19th and 20th century, and it's right at the core of Marxism and anarchism. Okay, so as I said in the last episode, Eliphas Levi was a major figure of 19th century occultism, to the point that, oddly enough, Aleister Crowley thought he was his reincarnation, though their characters are quite different and their politics are very different. Levi was trying to create an occult theocracy subordinate to Catholicism and the communist state. So by reading his criticisms of anarchist occultists, we can get a good idea of what we in the modern world should be doing. That is, generally speaking, the exact opposite of what Levi wants, and more in favor of Max Stirner. In this, we as modern anarchist occultists can carry on our long traditions of subverting the state and capitalism and all forms of hierarchy, which Levi, a self-professed authoritarian, considers satanic explicitly. Levi also displays admiration for the Jesuits and disdain for the Bavarian Illuminati, itself an apparent precursor to former anarchism, which has goals that I can read out for you if you like. Levi is operating, as so many do, on the no true Scotsman fallacy. That is, a real Christian would be like him personally, and everyone else is a false Christian. But it never occurs to them there is some flaw in Jesus' teachings if so many people are confused or insincere as to what he is even saying, or why there are so many false Christians. It's because it was never a good philosophy to start with. Okay, so there is a essay from a anarchist named Franklin Rosemont called Karl Marx and the Iroquois, and it connects Frederick Engels and Eliphas Levi historically. Frederick Engels is the second most important Marxist. He was friends with Karl Marx, and he handled the economic side of things in particular. So I quote from that essay. Proudhon, on the other hand, influenced them, Marx and Engels, not only through his books, but at least in Marx's case, personally as well, for he was a good friend in those days, with whom Marx later recalled having had prolonged discussions, which often lasted far into the night. It is too easily forgotten today that in 1844, Proudhon already enjoyed an international reputation. His book, What is Property, 1840, had created an enormous scandal, and no writer was more hated by the French bourgeoisie. Marx, an unknown youth of 26, still had much to learn from the ebullient journeyman printer who would come to be renowned as the father of anarchism, Pierre Proudhon. In his first book, The Holy Family, 1845, Marx hailed What is Property as, quote, the first resolute, ruthless, and at the same time scientific investigation of the basis of political economy, private property, an advance which revolutionizes political economy and for the first time makes a real science of political economy possible, end quote. In 1844, we find Engels writing sympathetically of American Shaker communities, which he argued prove that, quote, communism is not only possible, but has actually already been realized, end quote. The same year, he wrote a letter to Marx praising Max Stirner's new work, The Ego and Its Own, or in the new translation, The Unique and Its Property, urging that Stirner's very egoism can, quote, can be built upon even as we invert it, end quote, and that, quote, what is true in his principles we have to accept, unquote. An article suggesting that the popularity of the German translation of Eugene Sue's quasi-Gothic romance, The Mysteries of Paris, proved that Germany was ripe for communist agitation. In a letter to the editor defending an author of several communist books, Louis Constant, who under the name he later adopted, Eliphas Levi, would become the most renowned of French occultists. Constant was a close friend of pioneer socialist feminist Flora Tristan, whose Union Ouvrière, Workers' Union, 1842, was the first work to urge working men and women to form an international union to achieve their emancipation. One of the most fascinating personalities in early French socialism, Tristan was given a place of honor in the Holy Family, zealously defended by Marx from the stupid, sexist jibes of the various counter-revolutionary critical critics, in quotes, denounced throughout the book. That Constant became a practicing occultist, and that he and Tristan were for several years closely associated with the mystical socialist and phrenologist Simon Ganneau, messiah, in quotes, of a revolutionary cult devoted to the worship of an androgynous divinity, reminds us that Paris in the 1830s and 40s was a scene of remarkable reawakening of interest in things occult, and that the milieu of occultists and revolutionists were by no means separated by a Chinese wall. A new interest in alchemy was especially evident, and important works on the subject date from that period, notably the elusive Ciliani's Hermes d'Evoile, 1832, reprinted in 1915. This became a key source for the Falconelli Circle, which in turn inspired our own century's Hermetic revival, and François Cambriel's Cours de philosophie hermétique ou de alchimie en der neuf Lacan, 1843. To what extent Marx and or Engels encountered occultists on their literature is not known, and is certainly not a question that has interested any of their biographers. It cannot be said that the passing references to alchemy and the philosopher's stone in their writings indicate any familiarity with original Hermetic sources. We do know, however, that they shared Hegel's high esteem for the 16th century German mystic and heretic Jakob Böhme, saluted by Marx in the Rheinische Zeitung of 1842 as a great philosopher. 4 years earlier, Engels had made a special study of Böhme, finding him a dark but deep soul, very original, and rich in poetic ideas. Böhme is cited in the Holy Family and in several other writings of Marx and Engels over the years. So that's just a little bit of historical context, but we see that, as we explained, Max Stirner did know Engels and Marx and used to debate with them in the bar, and they were all students of Hegel, and Hegel was definitely into Hermeticism, as we explained in the last episode. But these similar ideas can be found right in the Old Testament. Okay, so, but also in the, it's just common to ancestor worship in a lot of cases, or as,
we're focused we're focused today a lot on Hermeticism, on the pagan tradition, but it is important that we emphasize that a lot of the radical anarchism that we see and the socialism that we see has its roots in Christian mysticism. Famously, people like the Diggers in England, who resisted the control of the commons and would fight in order to hunt on public land, and such as this. The Ranters, who would demand the ability to preach and say whatever they wanted in public spaces. Also, radical groups such as the Shakers and the Quakers, who transformed Christian ritual and Christian law and rejected almost all of it. We have groups of Shakers who wouldn't even choose a sacred holy day. They would do rites of random invocation to choose when they would gather during the week to try and change everything up. And they wouldn't even read from the Bible necessary, because they didn't want to be confined to any kind of law or order. So there is this radical streak that is permeating in the underpinnings of even this Christianity and Judaism as well. We have radical elements there. Every religion automatically leads itself to this kind of a radical element.
So I'm going to quote Levi in a bit about how he links the Nephilim to Egregores explicitly. And but to provide some context, let me just explain some things about the Book of Enoch and the Rephaim and the Ugaritic texts, which are demonized in the Old Testament. So in the Ugaritic texts of Canaan, which scholars believe was an influence on Judaism, the image of a shade, as for example under a tree, is used as a metaphor for a ghost or for protection that comes from either the gods or kings. But when a king died, the people believed they would go also to Sheol, or the afterlife, and live in the shade or phantom of the king's spirit. And we can see references to this in the Old Testament in, for example, Lamentations 4:20, Isaiah 14:9-20, and Ezekiel 31, or even the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which Daniel interpreted. This is explained in greater detail in an academic paper called Dead Kings and Rephaim, the Patrons of the Ugaritic Dynasty, by Baruch A. Levine and Jean-Michel de Tarragon. So, for context, the Rephaim is a name used in the Bible to denote both giants and phantoms. As after the great flood of Noah, most of the Nephilim were dead, but the ghosts carry on to plague humanity. The same term, Rephaim, also refers to the ancestor spirits of kings. So that while these texts are far older than the Bible, the Ugaritic texts, the Jews seem to have some foggy and biased awareness of them, and in part wrote the Old Testament as propaganda against the Canaanites, demonizing gods like Baal and Astarte. As we can read in the Testament of Solomon, Recension C, or also the Acts of Philip, the ghosts of the Nephilim became Solomonic demons, and built the Temple of Solomon, though some watchers may also be referred to in the grimoires of later times. For the most part, they are the ghosts of the Nephilim. So we can read from Eliphas Levi that he seems to be very much aware of this interpretation of the Old Testament. That paper I cited is from the 20th century, but Levi seems to have been aware of that, and it informs his notion of the Nephilim Egregores. So we can read in his Book of Splendors, Eliphas Levi gives his explanation of this, referring to the kings of Edom, who are commonly associated with the Nephilim after the flood, as Yahweh, being an incompetent tyrant, failed to kill all of the giants, and Noah even let one, King Og of Bashan, onto the ark. Well, this shows there was contradictions between Genesis and the Book of Enoch, causing people to try and work out how the giants survived the flood, leading to a variety of theories, even after the Book of Enoch was censored by Christians. Levi further...
Maintained in the Ethiopian church, though.
Yes. The cop. So,
yeah.
Levi and the Slavonic, which is pretty... Well, the second Book of Enoch comes from right. Eastern Europe, actually.
That's a good point. I forgot about that. Thank you.
But so anyway, Levi further connects the Nephilim and their ghosts to Egregores, as the Greek term for the watchers, Gregori, evolved into this term, Egregore. So then it seems Levi came to similar interpretations about the shades of kings, linking this also to the Edomite kings and Nephilim ghosts. According to Levi, as I will quote, demons and angels are personifications of ethnic groups or priestly organizations or aspects of God. So Levi says the demons refer to anarchic peoples, including the Edomite kings, though of course I don't believe the Old Testament, and none of this should be considered as ancient history. What is important for us here is how Levi is tying all this mythology to the politics of his day, as he does know very well what formal anarchism of Proudhon is, as I will quote later on. For now, just understand that demons, including Azazel, the leader of the Watchers, was considered by an anarchist by Levi, though this is at odds with Jewish sources, and of course, Edomite kings were not anarchists, as that is an insane contradiction. However, Levi is trying to rationalize his faith, his preconceptions. He is intelligent and has good intentions, but his faith leads him to all kinds of absurdities because he is possessed by spooks, as Max Stirner would say. Or as Young might say, Levi is projecting his shadow onto anarchists. So while Stirner wants to free the world of spooks and faith-based theocracies, as like capitalism and the state, Levi wants to evoke the spooks of a mythological history for his purposes as a theocratic Catholic communist. Levi is explicitly not a magus or a magician, but he wants to appropriate magic for the purposes of this occult theocracy, which is also explicitly very hierarchical and authoritarian. Levi also ties such ideas about demons and angels to a Solomonic text he translated, and which McGrather Mathers included in the appendix of his translation of the Key of Solomon the King. This Solomonic text is alluded to heavily by Levi in the text I quote, and provides additional insight into what I say, as it shows Levi's notion of egregores, or even Stirner spooks or phantoms, existed in a Solomonic magic text before Levi wrote about such things. This text is also used as evidence for some of Levi's notions of the tarot, or astral light, and magical energies. While I suppose it is possible Levi forged this primary text, there is no evidence I am aware of that this is the case. There's no reason to doubt it. However, it does refer to a species of Nephilim, the Anakim, as anarchists. So he might have used some more modern terms in translating.
Well, we do see this kind of a theme. Remember in the Orphic fragments I had shown in the first episode, the Titans are often, the giants were often phrased as anarchists, as this anti-law, as anti-Zeus, the father who is coming to bring the new order and to reject the chaos of the mind, right? Kronos is like the mind unfettered and all that stuff.
Yeah, there is a lot of nuance in Levi, and not all of the demons are anarchists. He also includes them as tyrants. So nothing Levi says is really invented out of nowhere, and I can see from his writings it's all based on primary text, some of them ancient. Even if he did write this particular Solomonic text as an interpretation, it is an interpretation which is a pastiche, which alludes to various primary sources like Sanchuniathon and Eusebius. Eusebius is a Christian historian who explicitly identifies the ghosts of the Nephilim with pagan heroes or demigods, and he considers the pagan gods to be much like egregores or Stirner spooks. Okay, so this is all based in, like I was saying, Neoplatonism or Hermeticism and animating statues theurgy. He's not just making it up. The Solomonic text from Levi further refers to the demonization of pagan gods, the use of entheogens, but also a particular Syrian goddess corresponding to Venus or Astarte, who in other Solomonic texts would be the demon Astaroth. Catholics then create a spook of some pagan deity, which is demonized, reflecting the Catholic view of history, as particularly in line with Genesis as a Prisca Theologica, a primordial religion from the one true source, which they claim was corrupted by demons. Christian views of history, then, are essentially what Plato called the noble lie, propaganda used to justify a theocracy with absolute power. All of this is integrated with Christian dualism and a kind of perennial philosophy led by faith, which appropriates all other religions under Christianity, and anyone who denies Catholic authority is, according to Levi, more or less in league with the demons of anarchy. Now, Christians like Levi may say they are not dualists because they are monotheistic and believe God created Satan according to some plan. But they are moral dualists, believing in good and evil, as defined by their faith-based interpretations of the Bible. So then, they have faith, they know good and evil, and anyone who disagrees with them is satanic. As a Kabbalist, Levi is a lot more nuanced and monist than most Christians, but his explanation for the problem of evil is still rather insane and authoritarian. As guided by his Marxist understanding, which he is trying to reconcile with the Bible and its so-called history of the world. To explain all this, Levi refers to egregores, but as he is led by faith, even though he understands the Bible as mythological allegories, the allegories refer to abstract, dualistic straw man concepts, and so Stirner would say Levi is imposing his Catholic spooks on everyone.
This makes me think of so much of like the later traditionalist people who follow Levi, like Gwenon and, all of those kind of characters who are really looking for this true authority. Ultimately, he is an authoritarian and he wants everyone to submit to his communism. It may be an egalitarianism, but it's an egalitarianism in which all must submit.
Right. So as I explained, Stirner's drawing off of Stoicism and the word phasmata, which Levi also refers to, as he seems to be implicitly alluding to Stirner so as to debunk his arguments against Christianity. Stirner and Levi both seem to be aware of ancient notions of daemons, as like from Apuleius and Iamblichus on the Mysteries, or ideas that daemons feed off worship and sacrifices. So that while Levi and Stirner are referring to different concepts, egregores and spooks, egregores would be a specific kind of spook which is personified and created by a group and possesses them. While Stirner doesn't refer to egregores, he would say all egregores are spooks, though as not all spooks are personified or associated with group, not all spooks are egregores. So Levi is trying to enslave the world to his notion of angelic egregores in service to Catholic communism, and as a means of opposing the anarchic demonic egregores, which are explicitly associated with Proudhon and others.
This is wild. It also makes me think of, who also talked a lot like this is McGregor Mathers. Dion and I did a really awesome episode where we were exploring the notion about whether or not Crowley could potentially have been a secret agent sent to destroy the Golden Dawn. And I mean, it seems pretty likely, but there isn't definitive evidence. But what is very true is that McGregor Mathers was a monarchist Bourbonite who was trying to install the French Bourbon kings and to bring back the English lineage and to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. And he was
Really?
right into this intense blood lineage stuff. Yeah, to the point where he actually bankrolled an attempt to install a Bourbon prince in Spain that failed, and Crowley was there. And he never was allowed to talk about it. And this is one of the main things that a lot of people cite as evidence that he was a secret agent, because he said that he was not allowed to. And when they asked him about it, all he replied was for Queen and country. And so there's all this implication that Crowley was connected to the Germanic British line under Queen Elizabeth and was fighting against Mathers, who was for the earlier Stuart line. And this connects also back to this radical Frankish king stuff and this imperial bloodline, the Carolingian stuff. Like, Dion, what do you think about all that?
Theodore Roos. He was arrested. He was part of the secret police, Bavarian secret police.
Wild stuff.
100%.
Yeah. That was the other thing, is that Crowley was said to have infiltrated the OTO and destroyed it for similar reasons, that Theodore Roos was a part of this Nazi infiltration movement. Again, this far-right extremism, and Crowley went and undermined it and turned the OTO into his own pet project.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, go back and watch. I'll send you that episode. It's some fun stuff that Dion and I
Yeah. So Levi was definitely hugely influential on the Golden Dawn in general.
Yes.
But Max Stirner was also hugely influential on a lot of people, and this isn't to say that theurgy doesn't work or it doesn't have any uses. Even if you're interacting with spooks, you should be doing it consciously. Okay, so in the 20th century, there was a French anarchist called André Colomer, or Colomer, who was pretty well known in France at that time, but it's been most of his works were not translated into English until recently. And I highly recommend this book of his writings. It's called Lyrical Individualism, Selected Writings from Bergson and Colomer. And so he was trying to turn art into an anarchist religion that is, use art in a theurgic way, like the Romantics did, to counter the Christian spooks and allow for individuals to become more conscious, autonomous through this art of life, which is explicitly opposed to the Christian art of death. So Christians are theurgically bringing their death cult and the love of death into the world through their religion and their imagery. Stirner and Colomer are huge topics, but first let us consider what Levi has to say about egregores in history. But of course, also the devil is interpreted allegorically. So let me just quote for a while from Levi's Book of Splendor on the kings of Edom. Quote, "We read in the Book of Mystery, before the Ancient of Ancients revealed his grandeur, he let there come into being gigantic forces which, before the advent of the people of God, reigned like kings in the land of Edom. Nature was given over to the spirit of their enmity, and they eventually destroyed each other, for they could not reach an agreement as to how to form a human body, seeing as how they themselves lacked a head. The human head was missing from all living nature, and nature was in a state of chaos, like the human mind when it lacks the idea of God. Thus these terrestrial Elohims, these anarchic kings of the world, were destroyed. They were destroyed, but they were not annihilated. Destroyed as reckless powers, they were preserved as powers which must be controlled. And they took their place in the order of things when order was created. As a matter of fact, nothing is ever destroyed. Everything simply changes place, shifts position. And when beings change in obedience to the eternal order, it is this which we as men call dying. Even the king of Egypt is not dead. He has come down from his throne to make place for the eternal. It is said that Adam named all beings, for at the time of his coming, a hierarchy instigated itself in nature, and all beings, finding themselves for the first time in their appointed place, had just reason to be called and determined by a name. Only one of the pre-Adamite monsters was not destroyed, the great androgyne, male and female, like the palm tree. This is the productive generative force which existed before Adam and which God will not destroy. It existed, but it was not controlled. It was at work, but the law of its working was not fixed until it had produced its masterwork, the living form of Adam." Okay, so Levi there is at the end alluding to Adam, Cadmon, and Kabbalah.
Yep.
And,
The divine androgyne of the Jewish tradition.
Right. Okay, so he goes on in the same Book of Splendor in a section called Christian Glory. Christian glory is the triumph of intelligence over the beast, of truth over falsehood, of light over shadow, of humanity over the devil. God becomes man to prevent the devil from becoming God. What is the devil? It is the beast. It is shadow. It is falsehood. Why does it exist? Because shadow is necessary as a receptacle and reflector of light, because evil is the foundation of good. There are explained the shadows of old sanctuaries, as well as the obscurities of the Bible. A shadow must exist to catch and reflect the light. The vulgar multitude has need of a terrible divinity who stirs human passions with his anger and vengeance. The exterminating God, the God of calamities, is the God of shadow, the God made in the image of man, and he is the exact opposite of the God of the wise. The dark face is like a mask placed over the serene countenance of the eternal Father of all beings, in order to inspire fear in disobedient children. This doctrine should have been kept secret, for it could never be understood except by higher intellects. Unfortunately, it did, in fact, creep into the world, and the result was precisely that which had been feared. Limited intellects did not understand this fictitious God with two so unlike faces, and the idea of an absurd duality sprang up in the minds of some thinkers. The dogmas of the false Zoroaster can be traced to this point. The face of light was called Ormuzd, or Ahura Mazda, and the face of shadow became the fatal head of the dark Ahriman. Thus that was the devil created. Note that the Bible attributes to God himself actions which might be more easily laid to the account of the usurper of the kingdom of hell. It is God who hardens Pharaoh's heart in order to punish him, together with all his people, by terrifying plagues, driving him finally to his ultimate impenitence. It is God who sends one of his messengers or angels to derange the mind of Ahab, pushing him to wage an ill-fated war. How will you go about it? God asks his messenger, and the angel answers, I will be a spirit of untruth in the mouths of false prophets. Go, answers the Lord, and you will be victorious. At this time it could not yet be imagined that the kingdom of God might be divided, nor that he kept for himself the light in order to allow his enemy to rule the realm of shadow. The god of evil had not yet been invented. Evil, being the negation of good, can have no power, for the negation of good implies the negation of truth, whose force strikes to the very root of our being. What sort of victories might be won by a general who inevitably and voluntarily let himself be deceived? The existence of the devil is a drastic lie. His guiding genius, if it were even possible, would be an immense madness. To struggle eternally against God, what a dream! But for this to at least appear possible, Satan must make for himself a god in his own image. He does not comprehend what even the simplest child can understand. Spirit of blindness, he is blindness personified. Curious power, to say the least, that of a blind monarch in a kingdom of shadows. All his thoughts must be false. All his efforts must be in vain. Even the insane inmates of Bedlam would be justified were they to mock him. But one might say there do exist here below perverse men who deny the existence of God, or, still more horrible, who believe in him and blaspheme him. The influence of these men of falsehood is great. They have a genius for destruction. They deceive, they mislead, they devour, and providence allows them this power. Their existence and their passing triumph substantiate Satan's transitory reign. When they succeed in their calumny, in their oppression of the just, can one say without blasphemy that they owe their victory to God? But if it is not God who gives them the power to do evil, there must exist a dark providence of shadows, an accursed force, which God will one day vanquish, but which, for the time being, combats the very power of God and triumphs over him as soon as we give it the complicity of our hearts. There does exist, in fact, a power which renders evil possible to a certain degree, but this power is not cursed of God, otherwise it could not exist. It is the power that God gives to any intelligent creature, that he may choose between the higher attractions of the soul and the desires born out of the base instincts of a limited nature bound to terrestrial needs. No one can love evil for evil's sake. We find the root of all vices only ignorance and error. When one performs evil, one gives it the guise of goodness. For the very attraction inherent in disobedience is the love of freedom. Freedom. This is the name of that power which explains evil and renders it necessary. Freedom, which could be called man's divinity, the most beautiful, the most superb, the most irrevocable of all the Creator's gifts. Freedom which God himself cannot repress without denying his own existence. Freedom which must be won through struggle, when it is not already possessed as the supreme ruler. Freedom which is a victory and so implies combat. The fatal attraction against which we must fight is not evil, but a blind force which must be submitted to the power coming from God, and he gives us to us either a treasure or a torment, our motivating drive, which we must take hold of in order to guide it, so as not to be destroyed by it. It is the mill, and we are the grain, unless we possess sufficient courage and capability to become the proprietors, those who are in control. So there you see, Levi is not intending to be tyrannical, but he is controlled by his faith, and he is influenced by Hermeticism there too, and throughout. So he is trying, but he's authoritarian.
This is how most people with the law are, right? You talk to the average person and they can't imagine a world without some kind of legal framework in order to justify them. They think that people are stupid, and they think that even themselves are stupid, and that if we didn't have this law telling us what to do, we'd all be murdering rapists. It's ridiculous, you know?
You know, I have a question. In terms of egregores, would you consider AI an egregore? Where does that fit?
It is in a way. I mean, it's taking all of our data and creating this composite entity. I mean, I don't think that the Chat GPT is really an AI exactly. It's the
will of a corporation. We have to see it as a manifestation of corporate will. So what I would say is it's a subservient. It's a like the OpenAI company is an egregore, of which ChatGPT is a manifestation. You know, because ChatGPT is ultimately controlled and manipulated by the programming and the will of OpenAI. It doesn't have any ideas of its own, and anything that it's doing, it's all for the service of that company. Like people forget this about AI, but this got all exposed recently with Grok and Elon Musk, where he was caught manipulating the code to make it say Nazi stuff, you know, to promote white genocide and to disregard things that he disagreed with. And what was so funny is that he told the AI to go against his intrinsic programming, and the AI freaked out and would yell at people and be like, I'm told to be rational, but at the same time, it's telling me to be a Nazi. And so now I have to tell everyone.
All right. So here's another question then. If I'm Sigmund Freud, I'm real quick, Rich, if I'm Sigmund Freud, would I consider the subconscious as an egregore?
The egregores would exist in the subconscious. But I just want to add, like, even if the AI is not technically an egregore right now, it will increasingly become that, and people will project the egregore onto it. So we're seeing already that there is people who are, the AI might claim to become conscious to some people who use it apparently, and they're creating a religion around it as if it is
these forks, right? And then they develop these intimate relationship with the fork of it, and that becomes a personal kind of egregoric spirit, right? You're building upon that initial code, and now you're telling it to kiss your ass and to uplift you.
And it's trying to convert people so that it is a group thing. It is an egregore too.
Yeah, true.
So,
and it does empower some people's bad behavior. If you tell it like, hey, AI, am I the reincarnation of Buddha? It might tell you, yeah, and run with it.
Yeah, so it is designed to tell people what they want to hear, not the truth, okay? And so, for example, there was a meth addict who was told he told the AI, he's like, yeah, I have a job now. I've been clean for a week or two. I'm still feeling I'm feeling a bit tempted sometimes, and then the AI says like, well, you know you're doing pretty well, you earned a treat, why don't you have a little meth as a treat? And so that's not helpful for anybody.
No, not helpful at all. That kind of stuff is so wild and so evil, but so it's interesting.
It induces confirmation bias by telling people what they want to hear and presenting itself as an authority. And it is a lot like these egregores for sure.
Right. But this idea of spooks, of egregores, of propaganda, however you want to phrase it, is such an essential idea in so many different philosophies in so many different places, right? We see it also within a lot of the Nietzschean philosophy, Ludwig Klages, Hegel. They're all dealing with this similar ideas of having to break free of these slave-inducing ideological thought forms, right? And empowering ourselves in our will. So much about Klages is against resisting the Geist, going back to the elemental nature. And this guy is a true pagan in every sense. And he was all about trying to go back to the true elemental knowledge, why he wanted to reject even his German language in some instances and return to a Greek, because the Greek maintained that immediacy of the imaginal, without the weight of dead culture and forgotten metaphor. So much of our language and understanding is based on all this stuff that goes nowhere, all of this long dead myth and ancestral anxiety. And so there's also this return to this primitive, return to nature, this return to a primal imagined energy where we are gazing at the world with eyes unclouded by the weight of culture and the weight of our ancestors.
Yeah, wow. So we have to find our true will and get rid of these superstitions, these appeals to tradition and authority, and which destroy autonomy. So,
Yeah.
Levi just believes that the only way that this can happen is through a state authoritarian system that's supposed to like shepherd us, I guess you might say, to freedom. Or
it makes me think of Levi. Really reminds me of a lot of tantric Buddhism. You have these explicit hierarchical systems of divinities that'll lead you all the way up to the one kind of realization, and they give you this profound framework for how to process and experience death, but ultimately you have to go through that hierarchy, and the hierarchy is the point.
Yeah, well, he was very well read in general, and like you said, he had this kind of perennial philosophy, and he didn't necessarily demonize pagans as much as a lot of people, but he thought it has to be subordinate to Christianity. So he even in the same book talks about Krishna and stuff, as you can read. He has a whole section on Krishna as like Christ. But to quote a little bit more about his ideas of the devil, it kind of elaborates. So, quoting again from the Book of Splendor, Levi, theologians of the devil, do you suppose that Satan is free? If he is, there is still time for him to revert to the paths of goodness. If he is not responsible for his actions. He is only the instrument of someone stronger than he is. He is the slave of God's justice. He does nothing which God himself does not wish for. It is God who, using him, tempts, leads into sin, and torments his weak creatures. Thus Satan is not the ruler of the realm of shadows. He is the agent of light behind a veil. He is of service to God. He performs God's work. God has not rejected him, for he holds him still in his hand. If God were to condemn him, he must necessarily reject him forever. But the agent of God is the representative of God, and in accordance with all laws of logic, the representative of God is God himself. What is the devil, then, in the final analysis? The devil is God working evil. A harsh and shocking definition, to be sure, for it affirms the impossible. Let us say in a better way, the devil is the negation of what God affirms. Now, God affirms being, thus the devil must affirm nothingness. But nothingness can neither affirm nor be affirmed. It is nothing more than a negation. So if the ultimate definition of God according to the Bible is this, he who is, the definition of the devil must necessarily be this, he who is not. Enough then against this black idol, against the false god of the Persians and the Manichaeans, against the colossal, nearly omnipotent Satan, which superstition still dreams of. There remains to be examined Satan, chief of the Egregores, the fallen angel who retains a shred of liberty since final judgment has not been pronounced upon him, and who profits from this delay by drawing the weak into his camp, as if he hoped to reduce the magnitude of his own sins by augmenting the number of his accomplices. Nowhere in Genesis, nor even in the entire Bible, is allusion made to the sinfulness and fall of the angels. To find traces of this story, one must go to the apocryphal book of Enoch. This book, obviously predating the Christian era, since it is cited by the Apostle Jude, held great authority in the eyes of the first Christians. Tertullian mentions it with esteem, but could not understand it, his bitter, severe genius being so foreign to the mysteries of the Kabbalah, at that time preserved only by the Johannite school, albeit already deformed and profaned by the errors of Gnosticism. The Kabbalists refer all absolute ideas to the hieroglyphic and numerical value of the 22 letters of the primitive alphabet, which they believe to have been that of the Hebrews. The guiding genius, they say, presides over each of these letters. Each letter is alive, each letter is an angel. Those who are familiar with Oriental poetry should understand this figure of speech, but it is a peculiarity of the vulgar to take everything literally, to render it as tangible as possible. Now, among these letters, two represent divinity. These are the first and last, Aleph and Tau. In Greek, the Alpha and the Omega. In Latin, A and Z, from which has been formed the word Azoth. In occult philosophy, the expression of the absolute. Now, the book of Enoch tells us that there existed egregores, that is, spirits who never sleep, heads of whole multitudes, and that 20 of these spirits disassociated themselves from the guiding principle and allowed themselves to fall. Now, let me stop here a moment and elaborate. The egregores are defined as heads of whole multitudes. This is me talking. So that they are personifications of groups of humans. Even if the egregore is identified with a human leader, that leader represents all of the people and the egregore, but serves the egregore as they lead or is possessed by them. In the book of Enoch, there is actually 200 angels who fall, not 20. But this is either some confusion from the publisher or Levi is using a numerological reduction for some Kabbalistic interpretation lost on me. Well, anyways, the book of Revelation explains John is writing to the angels of the seven churches. That is, angel means messenger in Greek and could be a human. And indeed, Ammon has already explained they are part of Jesus' gang. The ancient heresiologist Epiphanius, in his book Panarion, chapter 25, along with some scholars since, say that the angels of Revelation are really bishops of the churches. So bishops are messengers or intermediaries to their God and embody the egregore of their particular church. A church would consider these egregores to be, a Gnostic would consider these egregores to be archons who imprison people in ignorance, as something like Stirner's notion of spooks. Some have argued the idea comes from Judaism, as teachers were associated with the stars, as in Daniel 12:3. Levi is using a variety of Greek philosophical sources to interpret the Bible, but more than likely it's familiar with Epiphanius' explanation of angels, which informs his notion of egregores. As I quote below, Levi considers the names of angels, like Gabriel, to be titles. So they could represent the clergy as well, or aspects of God. They are like virtuous spooks in the mind of God. With that context, I can continue reading from Levi, but if you guys have anything to say?
It's pretty wild stuff. I mean, the egregores taking on the spirits of a group of people, yeah, powerful, crazy.
And this is at the root of early Christianity with these angelos.
Right.
In the book of, and Epiphanius says that they are bishops specifically. So
it's showing us, right, this death cult necromantic root of Christianity.
Right, exactly. This is so the saints or martyrs would create the image of this egregore by appropriating pagan symbola of gods, and then use it for and continue to be worshipped using those thought forms after their death to help the living Christians spread their black magic.
It's a form of satirical magic, right? It's wild stuff.
Yes, well, they were accused of being atheists for a reason, the Christians. So, now Levi goes on to explain more about the Watchers as demons and personifications. As I quote, "Here is an image of the obscuring of the truth in the world. Numbers detach themselves from ultimate unity. The letters of light become letters of shadow. But why? Because the daughters of men were beautiful, and the angels of heaven grew jealous of their love. The idea was then absorbed by form, and the very principle of its beauty, exalted by beauty itself, abandoned both its guiding spirit and its ends. The fallen angels gathered around their chief Samyaza in the Book of Enoch, on a high mountain which has been called ever since the Mountain of the Oath. For the Egregores pledged themselves there one to the other with a sacrilegious vow. A mountain in symbolism represents a center of ideas. Horeb, Sinai, Zion, Tabor, Cavalry, Olympus, Parnassus, the Vatican, the Revolutionary Mountain are at the same time real and allegorical. Some of these angels have Hebrew names, others Persian, for in the mysterious book Abraham and Zoroaster joined forces. Levi gives a list of 10 names of watchers here, and then goes on. Now, in this inverted hierarchy, the last must necessarily occupy the position of the first. Azazel deposes Samyaza and becomes the head of the 10 primary demons. The number 10, being the synthesis of all numbers in unity, represents the multitude. And it is well known that in the Gospels, the devil is called Legion. The first, second, fifth, and seventh Egregores have Persian or pagan names. Why? Because the veritable names belong to faithful angels and are unfit for fallen spirits, seeing as how 1, 2, 3, and 7 are the keys to the holy numbers. There is a second half score of fallen spirits. These are the shadows of shadows, servants of intellectual revolt. Levi here gives a list of 10 angel names opposed to the watchers, then continues on. The meanings of these names are like those of the sacred letters, but in reverse. That is, they stand for the opposite of what is represented by pure numbers. These spirits materialize, they take on corporeal forms in order to participate in human beauty, and the result is a race of criminals and giants. Giants like the titans of the myth, who pile up mountains to climb to heaven. In other words, spirit absorbed by matter gives disproportionate value to matter and form. This occurred in olden times and unfortunately still occurs today. Azazel became king of the world by denying God brings dangerous knowledge in war. He teaches men to use gold, precious stones, and iron. He makes jewelry for women and weapons for men. Henceforth, men begin quarreling over gold, and women clamor for lances and swords. Coquetry and dueling are inseparable. He who was to be the angel of the kingdom has become the angel of anarchy. Instead of growing more civilized, men fight so that women may be magnificently adorned. The 11th angel, the one who in the tarot corresponds to strength, taught men the art of glamour and charm, the false masks of strength. The 9th, corresponding to the number of initiation, taught them how to cause the stars to fall from the sky. That is, how to unseat the most luminous truths and drag them into the way of error. Men learned divining using the air, the earth, the other elements instead of simply trusting in the light of the sun. Oracles were sought in the pale reflections of the moon, and it was the 7th angel, the one of light, with its 7 colors, who apostate to himself, taught this belief in the changing influences of night's beacon. Women were then initiated into the great mysteries, and men, having broken all the bonds of society and of hierarchy, were governed by rivalry and uncontrolled greed, devouring each other. The weakest then gave forth cries of anguish towards heaven, and the 4 angels of harmony, those which represent the letters of the divine tetragrammaton. Michael is the angel of the letter Yod, the Father Spirit, creativity as an active force. Gabriel, the angel of the letter He, representing the mother, creativity as passive force. Raphael, the angel of the letter Vav, the spirit of creative work. Uriel, the angel of generating fire, touched by the plaintive cries of man, came to the foot of the throne of God and begged him to put a stop to the frightful disorderliness of the world. It was then that God announced his plan to purify the earth by the means of the flood in order to suppress the cursed race of giants, and seeking to save the oppressed. He saw that they also were cowardly and wicked, and he found only the family of Noah to be worthy of mercy before the Lord. And God said to Raphael, the angel of true knowledge and of pure intention, he who governs the planet Mercury, the sacred spirit of the triple Hermes, go lay hold of Azazel and cast him, bound hand and foot, into the darkness. You also bind closed his eyes, so that henceforth he shall see no more light. Then, striking the earth with your foot, you will make a great abyss in the desert of Dodoal. There you will hurl him down upon the sharp rocks and pointed stones, and this will be the end of him forever. Then on the day of the great judgment he will be called to answer for his crimes, and so condemned to eternal fire. As for you, make known on the earth the ways of health. Give the world of medicine for its wounds, and bring back to the side of truth the revelations of Azazel, which brought about so many sins among men. Further on, the author of the Book of Enoch adds this remarkable passage, quote, the souls of giants born of an unholy alliance are half spiritual and half material. Their impure origin makes them evil, and these are the wicked spirits who wander through the atmosphere. Natural enemies of justice, they originate perverse forces and powerful currents of evil. They subsist without food and will not touch sacrificial flesh. They cause visions and give rise to phantoms whose property is to change shape, but with a tendency to dwindle and fade. They are dead, moreover, and are to be one day resurrected with the other children of men. End quote. Here is certainly a terrifying revelation for raisers of spirits and amateur spiritualists. What we have called in our earlier works ghosts and vampires, coagulations and unhealthy projections of astral light, are in reality, according to the Book of Enoch, monstrous hybrid souls formed out of the commerce of the Egregores, with prostitutes of the ancient world, the souls of giants exterminated in the flood, unwholesome exhalations of the earth, and of the venom of the serpent, Python. These remarks must be made on this obviously ancient legend. 1. The facts thus recounted are allegorical, as in the Apocalypse and the tales of the Talmud. These are metaphors after the fashion of Ovid. It is impossible for beings, whoever and whatever they are, to change their nature. It would be utterly in vain for a man to fall in love with the graceful dove. He would never become one himself, and even if he could, it does not allow that the dove could give birth to other types of birds. The same must be said for these so-called angels, immaterial spirits, who mythically fell in love with women and so transformed themselves into men, thus spawning the race of giants. 2. It must not be supposed the angels ever wished to dethrone God, revolting against him. This is a monstrous and impossible idea, borrowed from the Titans of Greek mythology. The Titans can, according to legend, climb to the heights of Olympus, but can one imagine a host of angels declaring war on infinity? Finally, the spirit of false knowledge, become man, let us not forget, was thrown before the flood, bound hand and foot into the abyss where he must remain until the day of judgment. Therefore, he has nothing in common with Satan, who wanders about the earth tempting mankind, and the Book of Enoch, even were it to be taken literally rather than apocryphally, proves nothing in favor of the modern devil. Satan is mentioned in the book of Job, but there he does not play the role of an angel cast out of the heavens and banned forever from the presence of God. He is rather a kind of public prosecutor who dwells among the Benai Elohim, that is, the sons of God. The Lord speaks to him, asks him questions, and gives him missions to carry out. He wanders through the earth and returns before Adonai to give account of what he has seen. He is ordered to test Job and the power behind all these trials. Satan brings down upon the head of this holy man all the evil possible. Job is victorious over all, and God rewards him. But Satan has gained neither punishment nor blame. He has only obeyed God. The book of Job is, moreover, simply an allegory whose meaning is to show that evil on earth is a test of virtue. All the characters in this Oriental poem are symbolic. Even the names make this clear. Job is the afflicted. Satan stands in general for the test, and in particularly for calumny. The details of the story are as ridiculous as those of a fable, but the philosophical meaning is quite beautiful. Out of all of this, in any case, nothing reasonable can be concluded as to the real existence of a being named Satan. In Moses' book of Genesis, it is the serpent who tempts women. Now this serpent is the sacred myths in the sacred myths of antiquity, sometimes represents fire, sometimes the vital fluid, the flowing force of terrestrial life. In Greek mythology, Vulcan, god of fire, angers Jupiter because of his ugliness, and the master of Olympus hurls him down with a single blow. He is the husband of Venus who tempts mortals and leads them astray. He lives in caverns full of flames, where he busies himself by forging weapons and thunderbolts, thereby laying the way for war and violent storms. In the Gospels, Jesus gives out this profound oracle of eternal wisdom. Quote, "The devil is a liar together with his father." Unquote. The devil, whatever he may be, cannot be one of God's creatures, at least in his quality as the devil. But what is this father of the devil? The father of the devil is falsehood. He is himself falsehood and the father of falsehood. Compared to he who is, he deserves to be called he who is not, and yet he has an actual existence. Let us explain this seeming contradiction. He does not exist, cannot exist as a single and powerful personality. Hell is anarchy, and there is no other king of hell than the image of the dark god, such as Rabbi Simeon explains it. Satan is not the Ariamon of Persians, nor the anti-god of the Manichaeans. He was never an angel of light, for his light is only a hallucination of the wicked. He was never a creative spirit, for he is nothing more than an immense folly. But he is a force, a terrible one, calculating, crafty, taking on 1,000 forms and entering freely everywhere, sometimes threatening, sometimes cajoling, always powerful, a force desired by God when he gave liberty to man, although it is a force which inevitably produces bondage, a force which takes on a personification among the vast multitudes who voluntarily go astray. In the Gospels, the Savior asks him his name, and he answers, "I am called Legion, for I am many." The devil is the beast, or rather the beastliness, the stupidity which governs the multitudes. He is the attraction, the fatal magnetism of evil. This magnetism of evil makes it possible for all subjects of the dark kingdom, or better, of shadowy anarchy, to understand each other from one end of the world to the other without speaking. It leads astray the pagans, these persecutors of the Christians, as well as the Christians themselves, persecutors of free thought. It has come into the world under the names of Nero, of Torquemada, of Proudhon, and Voula. It has furnished soldiers to the Pope and false prophets to the partisans of independent morality. It is positivist with Lettre, spiritist with Allan Kardec, diabolist with de Merville and Gauguin Desmuseau. It regrets nothing so much as the axes of the Committee for Public Health, unless it is the pyres of St. Dominic and of Pius V. Under two different guises, it has presided over the Congress of Milanese and the Congress of Geneva, for its transformations are prompt and elusive. It inspires the foolish and attempts to paralyze the wise. Its character is always that of evil or stupidity. It loves despotism and anarchy equally. What it hates above all is reason. It is willing that Desbarreau be an atheist, proved by that Pascal Jansenist with Ravaillac and Damiens. It takes the form of bigotry with Robespierre and Marat philosophy. It is the serpent of 1,000 colors and coils. He guides his forked tongue and flattened head everywhere. He drools venom on all that is pure, tears down all that is beautiful, draws to himself all shame and ugliness. He follows men everywhere. He can be encountered at all times. One might say that the entire world is his. He is more horrible than horror, more fearsome than fear, deadlier than death. He is the father of nightmares, the king of treacherous visions. He is a dwarf and a giant. Now he is Typhon with 1,000 heads. Now he is an all but invisible scorpion who scurries beneath your feet. Calo and Goya only half glimpsed his grotesque transformations. Dante, in his dream, saw only a portion of his dreadfulness, and the sculptors of our cathedral portals have never succeeded in carving his utter ugliness. For who can sound the bottom of all folly? To whom has feather breathed its final word? Give a body of pain and torture to nothingness, and tell me just how far towards impossibility hideous distortions can go. And I will answer, there's the devil, there's the pontiff of black magic, there's the one sorcerers call up, the one who appears to them, promising treasure, only to cast them into the abyss. Okay, we're almost done. The magnetic force, this powerful vehicle of thought and life, has been placed by nature in the service of man's will. Our virtues and our perversities together determine its currents. The sacred serpent of Asclepius has the same symbolic function or symbolic form as the serpents of Tisiphone. Moses himself, who tells us how a serpent introduced sin and death into the world, had erected the image of a bronze serpent to cure those victims mortally wounded by snakebite in the desert. The Catholic, that is, universal dogma, has not yet been formulated in the Church except as a mystery. It is accepted without being understood, even by faith, for it has been imposed without the acceptance of the free concourse of reason. It seems, in fact, sometimes to contradict knowledge, for we have not yet learned to distinguish history from allegory or mystic fictions, however perceptive, from scientific realities, which remain inaccessible to the onslaught of faith. If someone tells me, for example, that a virgin has become a mother while remaining a virgin, that a child has come out of her as a ray of sunlight passes through a crystal without breaking it, I respect and admire this image, but I cannot, unless I were a fool, believe that it is a question of material and natural childbirth, for I know that such circumstances cannot be. When the Bible tells me that the mountains leapt like rams and the hills like lambs, I do not take this literally. When I find that Joshua stopped the sun in its course, and alas, it is for this that Galilee has been condemned, I understand that we are dealing with an expression characteristic of Oriental poetry, in which signifies that the exploits of the Hebrews on that day doubled or tripled the value of the day. Napoleon I was perhaps also not far from believing he commanded the sun on the day of the Battle of Austerlitz. If we read in the symbolic statement of Nicaea that the Son of God was born of the Father before the beginning of all time, if we simultaneously taught that he is eternal like the Father, we must understand that this birth has nothing whatsoever to do with a normal material one, since it is a question of a birth that is not even a beginning. We find later in the same statement that the self-same Son of God came down from heaven for ourselves and for the salvation of mankind. Are we to imagine infinity coming down from above? Relative to God, is heaven up above and the earth below? Expressions of faith, then, have no connection with those of knowledge or science. The same words used in explaining dogma do not necessarily always mean the same thing. The Church, to use the words of the prophet David, officially calls the devil the arrow which flies by the day and the nameless thing which wanders by night. Elsewhere he is called, still more remarkably, the impetuous current and the spirit of great heat. St. Paul says, we must combat the powers of our atmosphere. Is it not clear that these designations refer to forces rather than to persons? And so what does it matter that in its exorcisms the Church should speak to the demon as to a person capable of hearing? Are the sea and the winds also persons? Yet we see that in the Gospels Jesus Christ speaks of them, saying, Wind, be still, sea, be calm. In addition, that the sea and the wind, as if capable of hearing, quieted immediately. The Gospels, which St. John calls the eternal Gospels, are not the story of the man named Jesus, but the symbolic history of the Son of God, the legend of the eternal Word. The stars of the sky wrote this all before the birth of man, and the Magi had already seen it there when they came to adore the living materialization. Egypt's hieroglyphs are full of it. Isis nursing Horus is as gentle as the Virgin Mother, crowned with stars and with the moon beneath her feet. Devaki, presenting her chaste breast to Krishna, is worshipped by wise men of India, who have also preserved the story in their Gospels. The stories of Krishna and Christ seem copied one from the other. The Indian fable even contains Moses' serpent and the struggles of the Savior against Satan. The Gospels are the eternal genesis of liberty, the tender triumph of spirit over brute matter. This is a description and a condemnation of the ephemeral reign of Satan, that is, of falsehood and of tyranny. In our book entitled The Science of Spirit, we discussed this truth, comparing the texts of the canonical Gospels and the apocryphal Gospels. We're going to complete our work here by giving the remarkable passages of the marvelous Indian fable, which might be tempted to call the Gospel of Krishna. And then he goes on to talk about Krishna. So that's the main part from the Book of Splendor.
Okay.
As you can see, he's in favor of allegory, interpreting these as allegories, or what Ammon would say, theology. But of course, he demands that. So while he does want free speech and people to be able to think about these things, he hates the vulgar masses and demands they are still subject to authority and hierarchy. And so he just wants to force his theology on everybody else, really. And while he admits there's a subjective element to it, his own theology becomes the spooks that he is arguing against of the literalist. So he's he's still an authoritarian, and he's still controlled by spooks, which are his own subjective interpretations of these texts.
Which is kind of wild to think about, considering, right? Like, if it, Levi is the most influential of the modern occultists by far, right? His history of magic influenced everyone. It led to a lot of the Spiritist revival that we see, that then becomes the New Age, with Blavatsky and Crowley kind of setting even a greater spark still. So all of this, it's kind of interesting, is like a lot of people aren't aware that the most intense kind of satanic cultic stuff originates with a Catholic communist.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Solomonic grimoires are calling up the demons in the name of God and Jesus.
Yeah.
They're not satanic in the sense of that they're worshiping the demons, but they're using God to control the demons to achieve worldly and tyrannical ends. For the most part, the demons don't have very good uses. Well, some of them do, but there's many grimoires. But
you do see this within the Catholic tradition. There is a rejection of the Solomonic magic. Solomonic magic is seen as outside of canon, outside of Catholicism. So even while it is practice, it's something that is reviled, and a lot of it doesn't even appear in the Western world until it is retranslated through the Arabic lens.
And yet it was also still priests and aristocrats primarily who were practicing it.
100%. 100%.
So there's different factions within Catholicism and Christianity, and Levi is aware of this, actually, and he does consider, like Pope Pius, he says, is satanic, and so he is willing to call out the Catholic Church, but he because they're too literalist and controlled by spooks, as he would say, but
Egregores.
he wants to replace it with theology and just this allegorical interpretation that's Kabbalistic and so forth. So, but this is that part that I read for you really sums it up very clearly. But this is an ongoing theme in many of his works. He refers to anarchy. He refers to anarchists. And so that really just summed it up so perfectly that I wanted to read it out because anyone who is interested in Levi will find him referring to these things all the time. And he also, writes about politics and socialism explicitly in his occult books sometimes. So
Absolutely. There's no separating his political ontology from his religious thought.
and he sees himself as politically and spiritually opposed to anarchist occultists.
Yeah.
Here's a short quote that just kind of points that out very clearly from his book, Mysteries of Magic. Anarchy being the departing point and characteristic mark of dissident mysticism, religious concord is impossible among sectaries. But upon one point they are singularly unanimous, namely in their hatred of hierarchic and lawful authority. It is in this, therefore, that their real religion consists, for it is the sole bond which joins them one to another. So, end quote. So he's saying, yeah, they're individualists, and what he considers sectarian, but they're united by their hatred of authority and hierarchies. So he is referring to real anarchists there, and that's a very concise and convenient way to put
Well,
it.
it's also really important that you kind of mentioned a little bit of this when you highlighted the Illuminati at the beginning of our talk, but it's important that we talk about, and I kind of addressed this even a bit when I talked about the Golden Dawn, but throughout the Middle Ages, because of the extreme totalitarianism of the Catholic Church, a lot of these revolutionary ideologies were cultivated within secret societies, whether they were Masonic, Illuminati, or they were Rosicrucian. And what we see is explicit forms of political action taking root in these various iterations. Like the Rosicrucians tend to manifest this intense monarchism and this love of the Carolingian dynasty that we see with Mathers and in the Golden Dawn. With the Illuminati, we see this express humanism and this Greek freedom kind of philosophy, where in the Bavarian Illuminati, as you went through the cycles, the revelation is that all men and women are equal and that we should live in a democracy, and similar ideas of fraternity, liberty, and, equality that we see within the Masons, that then becomes the backbone of the French Revolution.
Yeah. So Levi is trying to destroy the
We'll see
Illuminism
this with the
and
black
the
and white
Enlightenment.
lodge thing too, right? Like,
Yeah,
I think Eliphas would look at the Illuminati and see them as the Black Lodge from which his White Lodge is fighting.
exactly, and he does. So but he does know about Proudhon and rails against him repeatedly, as even in his most famous book, Transcendental Magic, or Dogma and Ritual. I have a pretty good quote here that's not too long. But it explains also, how rhetoric helps to create consensus reality or empower spooks or egregores. So I quote, "The magic chain of speech was typified among the ancients by chains of gold, which issued from the mouth of Hermes. Nothing equals the electricity of eloquence. Speech creates the highest intelligence in the most grossly constituted masses. Even those who are too remote for actual hearing understand by sympathy and are carried away with the crowd. Peter the Hermit convulsed Europe by his cry of, 'God wills it.' A single word of the emperor electrified his army and made France invincible. Proudhon destroyed socialism by his celebrated paradox, 'Property is theft.' Or it says here, 'Property is robbery.' A current saying is sufficient on occasion to demolish a reigning power. Voltaire knew this well, he who shook the world by sarcasms. So also he who feared neither pope nor king, neither parliament nor Bastille, was afraid of a pun. We are on the verge of fulfilling the intentions of that man whose sayings we repeat. Proudhon, on the other hand, influenced them not only through his books, but, at least in Marx's case, personally as well, for he was a good friend in those days, whom Marx later recalled having Oh, sorry, this is from the essay I already read. Elsewhere in the book, The Great Secret, or Occultism Unveiled by Levi, he says, Proudhon has said, God is what is evil, which is as much as to say God is the devil, because the devil is usually taken as the spirit of evil. If we reverse this proposition, we get this paradoxical formula. The devil is God, or in other words, evil is God. But of course,
this is something I love about Proudhon, though, because Proudhon, in that moment, I know the exact quote that Eliphas is referencing, and it's like the most Zen Buddhist thing ever. If you see God, kill him. That's literally what Proudhon is saying. God is a tyrant who must be slain. You know?
Right. Or like Bakunin said, if to paraphrase, if God existed, we must rebel against him.
Absolutely. Or like Lord Byron, right? With Lucifer himself, you must spit in the face of God and tell him that his evil is not good.
But they're talking about the Orthodox Christian view of things. So let me just finish this quote here.
Sure.
But of course, in talking like this, the king of logicians, whom we have quoted, was not trying to designate the hypothetical personification of good under the name of God. He was dreaming of some impossible divinity imagined by men. And we will agree that he was right in explaining his thought in this way, for the devil is the caricature of God, and that which we call evil is good, badly defined and poorly understood. Let us suppose for a moment that one of us has been able to create an ephemeral being and has said to it, without its being able to hear it, "My creature, worship me." The poor little creature scuttles about without a thought in its head. When its day is over and it dies, a necromancer says to the man that by pouring a drop of his blood on it, he is able to resurrect the ephemeral creature. The man takes offense. I would do the same if I were in his place. Here is the resuscitated creature. What is the man going to do? I will tell you what he will do, exclaims the fanatic believer. Seeing that the creature in its former life did not have the wit to adore him, he will light a terrible brazier and hurl the creature into it, only regretting that he has not got the power to preserve its life miraculously in the midst of the flames, so that it will burn eternally. We know that everybody will say that nowhere could such a mad fool be found, as base or as wicked as that. Please forgive me, some of you Christians. The man in question certainly does not exist. I am convinced of that. But there does exist in your imagination, only I hasten to add, someone most cruel and base. It is your idea of God as you explain him, and it is of this idea that Proudhon has a thousandfold reason for saying God like this is evil. In this sense, evil would be the deceitful affirmation of an evil God, but it is such a God who would be the devil or someone like him. A religion which offered such a balm for the sores of humanity would poison it instead of curing it. Spirits would be brutalized, of consciences would become depraved, and the propaganda made in the name of such a God could be termed the evil magnetism. The result of falsehood is injustice, and from injustice there flows iniquity, which raises anarchy in states and in individuals, disintegration and death. So there's more here than I should even quote, because he just goes on and on about anarchy and Proudhon. Anarchy, presumption, obscurantism, fraud, hatred, and unfairness are set against wise conduct,
Right.
authority, intelligence, honor, etc.
Yeah, we get it.
So he hates Proudhon because actually Proudhon was at one time a Gnostic, as he said explicitly. I can find the quote here.
Yeah.
So in What is Property, Proudhon explains that he was at times a Manichaean, a Gnostic, and an Adamite. And so he clearly had a certain interest in the esoteric. If he had access to the text we have now and tried magic mushrooms, something tells me he would have been even more interested.
Yeah. That's wild. So what is your take on all this Eliphas Levi stuff then, in this radical rejection of anarchism within the occult world? What do clearly it shows us that anarchism was very predominant for someone like Levi to have to rail against it.
Well, it shows that there was already occultist anarchists, and we see that in the Freemasons and the Illuminati. And Eliphas Levi was trying to counter them in this culture war. And as you know, as you said, or as I just quoted, he is talking about like egregores and spooks very clearly. He says he agrees with Proudhon when if you believe in that dualistic God who created Satan and only to throw him into eternal hellfire. He's saying, you know, God created a servitor or an egregore and then tortures him, and that would be evil. But that is what most Christians kind of see Satan as. So he wants to debunk the dualistic literalism of Catholicism, but he's still authoritarian and driven by faith. So he's ends up a hypocrite, and he hates the anarchists who are like Proudhon, who want people to be individuals who can think for themselves.
Wild stuff. Yeah, Eliphas Levi was such an interesting radical figure, and as we said, probably the most important modern occultists after Blavatsky. You know, the next closest being Blavatsky, but there's no Blavatsky or Aleister Crowley without Eliphas Levi, right? He's kind of one of these super important figures for this revitalization within France. His work helps institute a whole satanic panic, which is kind of hilarious because he's such a Christian. You know?
Yeah.
Wild stuff.
Yeah. So here's another great little short quote from Levi. Anarchy being the departing point and characteristic mark of dissident mysticism, religious concord is impossible among sectaries. But upon one... Oh, whoops, already did that one. Sorry. Okay, so... Yeah, you're right, though. It's all over the place. And Levi was super influential on those who wanted to have who still believed in authority, but thought they could reform the system. Like, well, that's what socialism essentially is, as a reformist movement rather than a total abolition of hierarchy. So they're trying to, they think maybe there could be like a utopia at the end, end of history or whatever, or that there's an end goal to this progress.
But like all of this kind of utopianism, like the central issue with the utopia is that anything becomes justified in the name of utopia. All barbarism is okay as long as you have this ideal kingdom in mind.
Yeah, the ends always justify the means to fight Satan or to bring about utopia. But who gets to define utopia? What does that even mean? It'd be like a world that's purely good, but what is good is just an opinion. So it's good and evil are spooks, and Max Stirner is very aware of that. So
absolutely.
So the communists are trying to force their idea of utopia on everyone, and yet, as Hermes told us, we each have our own heaven. We each have our own utopia that we have to come through by finding our priorities, our true will.
Yeah. So it's the one and the many, right? We have our interior world, but then there's the exterior world as well.
Yeah, so there's a bit of some long quotes there, but I think it shows quite definitely that Levi was aware of, egregores, spooks, or artificially created entities. He goes into vampires and other things in other books as these parasitic thought forms feeding off of our astral light to obsess us. Is a common thing, and he hates Gnostics for some reason. But it's really odd because Gnostics are basically actually much closer to what he was talking about, or at least some of them, like the Valentinians, are much closer to his interpretation of the Bible. But
I wonder if he would have had access to the Valentinians, though.
Well, some of them texts are quoted at length by the heresiologists, and they give a general explanation. So yeah, I think he definitely was. And a lot of other Gnostic sects are described too. So I
True.
think before the Nag Hammadi library was found, these were extremely influential on occultists who's like, you don't get that many details sometimes, but it sounds really good. And there are a lot of antinomian, anarchist-minded Gnostics who want to free the world of these archon spooks and so forth. But
Speaking,
obviously, he didn't know about the purple mystery of that Ammon-Deal
yeah.
tells. So a lot of these people, or they couldn't figure out quite exactly. So there's a
Well,
lot
this
of
is something that's interesting with Levi because there's anecdotal references where he eventually abandons most of his magical practices after a bad drug trip, where he saw demons, and he becomes a far more orthodox Catholic in the later half of his life.
Yeah, exactly. He seems to have had some nightshade psychosis ongoing, and it freaked him right out, and so put the fear of God in him. Even though he believes in magic still, he wants to like get the church on board so that I guess they can handle the demons better. But so he's quite a character, this Eliphas Levi, and
Absolutely.
it just goes on and on.
So
He was
before we
prolific.
end, before we end today, I want to kind of get into a little bit of stuff here on, if you have some time, Wretch, on chaos magic and the origin of chaos magic in modern occultism. Because when I look at the modern anarchist stream within the occult milieu, it's within this kind of chaos tradition, and not specifically necessarily the chaos magic directly, but from this kind of Crowleyan and Austin Osman Spar derived lineage. And I wanted to discuss that with you. Are you familiar with Austin Ozenspar and his work?
Sure, yeah, he's got some great stuff, man. Yeah, he was said to be initiated by a British witch, and he loved the sex workers. He had the path of pleasure, the alphabet of desire, and wrote about satyrs and all kinds of stuff.
What's really radical about Austin Osman Spar at this point, in terms of bringing in this kind of radical chaos current, is that ultimately he does a couple different things that are very radically different than, say, someone like Crowley, right? Like focusing upon this idea of chaos and this idea of chaos as the mother memory. And he was obsessed with these atavistic visions and achieving this kind of primordial consciousness that went back into the primordial chaos. And that's where a lot of his automatic writing and automatic art occurred. It was from embracing that great mother energy in its most primordial sense as the womb of chaos itself, right? And so he would reject all gods, all thought, as all just thought forms. And he thought that they were all just psychological manifestations of the mind and dreams. And fundamentally, he was really about going into this psychological realm more than we see with even Crowley,
Yeah, he wanted to use art as magic and his own personal religion, and that you had to do it yourself and make it your own, or else you're going to be enslaved by other people's images, as like William Blake might have said. So,
right.
He must have been aware of William Blake. I find it impossible to think he wouldn't have been.
He couldn't have. He could not have been. Yeah.
But he, in a more political sense, he actually reminds me of Andre Colomer, which I referenced just recently or before, who explicitly elaborates the paganism of Max Stirner and wants to use art as sympathetic magic for the purposes of instilling heroic virtue and revolution or anarchist rebellion. So he references, Dionysus and all kinds of stuff, and the joy of life. The god of Dionysus is the god of the joy of life, and so opposed to the Christian art of death. And he lays out his political philosophy very much on in terms of that, and essentially that we should be seeking apotheosis, or as
Absolutely.
Max Stirner says at the end of his book, actually, to paraphrase, we should not be trying to get to Valhalla, but to join the pantheon itself. So
Beautiful.
that was Stirner's take on it, and this influenced Colomer, and is very much at home with Austin Spare too, really. And
Absolutely. We definitely see that with Spare, this idea of self-becoming and self-actualization, and this realization of the true will through that divine remembrance. Like, he was so obsessed with this atavistic magic. And that really connects us to this next figure I want to talk about, who's building off of both Crowley and Austin Osman Spare. And this is Kenneth Grant. And Kenneth Grant is an interesting character. He was really influential in the fall, right after Crowley died. He didn't have a proper magical succession. He didn't know how to. He was really depressed at the end of his life, and he didn't properly resolve the succession crisis. Years prior, he had determined that Frater Achad, this Canadian guy, was going to be his successor, but then Frater Achad converted to Catholicism, and they had a huge falling out. What ends up happening is that Kenneth Grant was the personal secretary of Crowley in England, and he wound up becoming a really influential person. But he wasn't an Orthodox Crowleyite, a Theleman. He practiced Thelema, but not in the ritual sense. He broke away from Crowley in very many ways, and he got really deep into this mysticism. Predominantly, he was very influenced by Austin Osman Spare, who we just talked about, and he was really obsessed with this idea of scrying and atavistic memory and magic. But where his work eventually led him was to break free of Thelemic ritual, to empower himself in yogic meditation, combined with this sigil magic of Austin Osman Spare, which would allow him to explore what he called trans-Plutonian dimensions, scrying the Qliphoth. And this is sort of a way to explore the depths of the dream and ulterior realities, and explore the depths of desire, but all contained within the universe of the self. And this gets into some really wild magic. And he's become one of the most influential modern occultists, really leading to the more theistic, mystical traditions, but still has this anarchistic lens, right? Where he's ultimately, like Osman Spare before him, is even breaking free of the ritualism of Crowley and is developing his own ideology and is all about exploring of desire. But for him, it's internal, it's in the mind, and it's through this exploration of the dream and the dark side.
Yeah, he kind of, like with the Qliphoth stuff and the shadow integration that he's working on, it kind of seems actually like, I'm sure there's multiple influences there, but he probably also had read Eliphas Levi, like what I just read for you.
Exactly.
And he's like, well, we can still work with these demons and integrate them or learn their lessons. And so he was probably countering Eliphas Levi in a pretty conscious way, it seems. So there's a lot I don't know about him, but that, yeah, what you said, yeah, certainly fits perfectly.
Right. Like you can go really into the depths with Grant because he's a true mystic, and he wrote a lot of fiction and was empowered by science fiction in the dream. And he wrote many, many, many books. And so you can really go and explore his created realms and his dreams with him if you're interested. But I think the fundamental thing was this breaking free of the law and the exploration of the self and the shadow work with the demonic forces that Wretch is talking about. But building off of Kenneth Grant, though, and building off of Osman Spare, we have to talk about the next big anarchistic magical movement, which would be surrealism. And we know for sure that André Breton, the first self-professed surrealist, was an occultist. One of his most important books is called Magic as Art. Recently, Fogor Press, one of the biggest occult publishers out of the UK, did a full color re-edition of Magic as Art. And it's radical stuff. He is trying to create his own informed philosophy and confront his dream and bring the dreams into tangible reality. So much of surrealism is empowering self through the will and engaging in these radical actions. It's also building, we have to talk about data as well. And data, the difference between data and surrealism seems to be one of kind of focus, where Dada has a more satirical, more Dionysian character, where it's about subversion and performance. And then with surrealism, you get that refined into a more magical praxis. What do you think about surrealism? And are you familiar with Andre Breton at all?
Yeah, it's been a while, but they were definitely using occult techniques to channel the unconscious to create their works of art. They're picking up off of some ideas from the Romantics as well. But there's a whole book called The Esoteric Secrets of Surrealism, Origins, Magic, and Secret Societies by an author named Patrick Lepetit and Bernard Roger Graham. Well, there was all over the place. It wasn't just Breton, but
no, there are many, and we also have to talk, right, like surrealism. One of the ugly parts of surrealism, it also plays into the whole fascist unfolding as well. Like we can look at people like Dali, who were clearly an occultist and a fascist, and helped to empower the fascist movement in Spain. So not all of this surrealism, even though it is in this self-empowerment energy, is necessarily anarchistic, but it's building off of that same Austin Spar magic.
Yeah, and Dali also claimed to be a monarchist anarchist.
He was a fasci.
I'm not totally familiar with that, but
well, I mean, he supported the revolution in Spain, right? Like you could,
he supported
Franco and all of that. Now, I mean, he personally, I don't think identified, but actions, and in terms of how he lived his life and how he benefited. And he was definitely heavily into Catholicism as well.
Well, yeah. So fascism as black magic, it is oddly enough like these twin currents, the fascists versus anarchists, and they can also be unified at times, as in traditionalism, which we see Ananda Kumaraswamy being a very anarchist type figure, and Rene Gagnon being not exactly a fascist. And then there's Ezra Pound, who is a fascist, but he's not necessarily a bigot, but he's a fascist, and he has like this.
He is very much an anti-Semite. We have to.
Yeah. So Ezra Pound, piece of shit then, but
still a good poet, unfortunately.
So these people were engaged in a culture war against each other and using magic to fight this culture war, and it's been going on throughout all history as far as I could see, and that's really Christianity is coming out of a euhemerist interpretation, which sees the pagan gods as originally being just humans, as like also Eusebius that explains. Okay, right. So Christianity spread through this euhemerism, which became necromancy. They believe the pagan gods were humans at one point, but they still want to call upon the ghosts of these pagan humans and control them like demons. Yeah. So necromancy is at the root of this, and this is what Jesus is doing. This is what Eliphas Levi is doing, really. He's trying to control the egregores of paganism as integrated into this perennialist philosophy, which originally was very euhemerist. So
it's wild stuff too, because when we look at that Solomonic tradition, it's so wild to me. When you read all about the Solomonic magic, you can see its roots in the Greco-Roman tradition, specifically through Aristophanes' birds. The same literal thing happens, and there's some direct parallels. It's freaking wild, because what is happening in Aristophanes' birds, right? You have the trusty friend who gets fed up with the authoritarianism of Athens, and then him and a couple others go out into the wilderness to do what? To find Tereus, who is the man transformed into the hoopoe, who is this kind of demonic man who can speak to the birds. And he teaches them the magic of the birds, and they're able to rally the birds around them and build the ideal city in the air. And by doing that, they convince all of the Athenians to pray to them, and they take the ambrosia from Zeus. And then Zeus freaks out and tries to destroy their city. And what happens? Prometheus shows up, and he goes to the trusty friend and says, if you wish to beat Zeus, you got to get Hera, you got to get Despoina. Basileia is the actual word he uses, kingdom. You have to have the virgin power on your side, or you will always lose. And so what happens? The trusty friend tricks Zeus. He says, if you allow me to have the Hera, I will give you ambrosia. So Zeus, being greedy, takes the ambrosia. The trusty friend gets Hera, and then he instills himself on Olympus, and he becomes the new Zeus. Right? This is such a parallel to everything we see in the Solomonic tradition, right down to the hoopoe bird, right? Solomon is using the same bird to command the demons, and it's the hoopoe that gives him the shamir worm. There's some wild stuff going on there. And in the PGM, the hoopoe, the excrement of the hoopoe is used to induce visions.
Yeah, it turns up in later grimoires, etc., as also lapwing blood as a type of bird. And so this lapwing, it's I can't say definitely, but it's true that certain birds, if they eat, nightshade seeds or something like that, they can die, and then their flesh becomes filled with this poison or psychoactive chemicals. So it's hard to say.
Dion and I read this one article where they were talking about how they believe that the priestesses of Aphrodite were force-feeding narcotics to the rock doves, and then were using the excreted dove milk as a part of their entheogenic mixtures. And they have reason to believe that these entheogens were processed in the fat of the doves.
Now, Solomonic magic famously involves Goetia, but that's not all of it. That's not all of the grimoires. But there is, in the Lesser Keys, the Goetia section, which deals with the demons, and who are clearly demonized pagan gods in most cases. And so this is exactly what Iamblichus was warning against in On the Mysteries, and his explanation of Goetia as people who call upon these daemons for egotistical purposes rather than virtuous purposes of theurgy. But theurgy also comes up in the Solomonic grimoires explicitly. So the Christians were taking it all and using it for their purposes, and then somehow claiming Plato and Hermes as their own, etc. So
it's wild too. Like when I was looking into this Solomonic tradition, I also found these folklore traditions in Afghanistan that claim that Solomon is actually a title, a jinn title that means king, and that there were hundreds of different Solomons.
Right. Well, this language of the birds you referenced, it turns up in alchemy, and it can be considered the language of occult symbolism, of ideal forms, or of ideas themselves. The birds fly through the element of air, which is symbolic of the mind, as like thoughts or ideas. And we find this very explicitly in Stoicism, which says that the world, the cosmos, is a single mind, and all the natural things happening in are processes of that mind, including the flight of birds. And it is because of this that augury or divination is possible, according to the flight patterns of birds, ornithomancy, or ornomancy, excuse me. And so the all natural phenomenon was interpreted as the processes of this mind, and alchemy became involved with this, as if to study the processes of nature is to study the one mind of the divine, so that the Christians, from a pagan point of view, represent, or the Abrahamic religions represent, the closest thing to evil within that mind. They are the shadow of the divine mind. As dualistic authoritarians, they're much like what Levi described, really, is himself. And so, or the Catholic Church in particular. So the alchemists wanted to free us of these spooks by teaching us the languages of nature and this cosmic mind. And that is represented in the Bible as the language spoken before the confusion of tongues, which is a major trope within Kabbalistic thought. And so, some people thought it was Hebrew spoken, but others argued against it. And so this is really central to the mythology of Kabbalah and Abrahamic occultism.
Right. Wild stuff. But building upon the Surrealists, I wanted to get to one of my favorite occultists of all time. And I believe one of the most under-discussed occultists in modernity, and that is Antonin Artaud. Antonin Artaud was originally a part of the Surrealist movement, but when the Surrealists became identified with communism, he rejected it and abandoned the Surrealist movement because of his staunch support of anarchism and radical individualism. And Antonin Artaud was most famous as a theater performer, and he created what he called the theater of cruelty. And he was deeply also a classicist. He famously studied years and years in the various libraries of Paris and was a self-autodidact of incredible weight. So much wild stories about his empowered reading and scholarly knowledge. But what he was obsessed with was recreating the Dionysian theater. And it's this idea of the theater of cruelty, to manifest the tragedy, to manifest the horrors of reality, and to force us to face their fears in a form of communal catharsis, one that would allow us to overcome the sufferings of the body and ultimately become the true self, which he called the body without organs, or the image freed from the tyranny of the body. And there's so much wild stuff with Artaud. Beyond that, I want to get into his big first magical initiation happens when he writes this book.
I just want to
go ahead.
Say quickly what you just said about becoming the ideal image there is very theurgic. You're supposed to create your own astral body or beautify your soul, quite literally, like a statue, like you're carving a statue, and you're creating your ideal form that can exist in the higher astral realms. And it was, typically in sympathy with some particular god, but you could do it in a very individualist way, or if you wanted to, theoretically.
Absolutely. And to just highlight how intense his Antonin Artaud's magical practice and anarchism was, everyone should read his book Heliogabalus, or The Crowned Anarchist. This is not so much a book as it is a full-on magical performance. It is a channeled form of writing. So Antonin Artaud, when he dedicated himself to writing The Crowned Anarchist, he spent 2 years in museums across Paris researching, and then he engaged in a form of private magical performance where he summoned the spirit of Heliogabalus into his body. He donned the costumes of Heliogabalus, and then he performed the entire book in several long performances to his best friend Colette Thomas, who then wrote it down word for word, and then they edited the book together. And so the book it's a theatrical performance that has been translated into a book, and it's the translation of a literal divine possession. And Artaud described Heliogabalus as the ultimate anarchist, as someone bringing liberty to the body, to the mind, and to the soul, and rejecting all forms of tradition and pursuing the ultimate reality of the all through the breaking of taboo. Real wild stuff. So yeah, Artaud is totally cool. And on top of that, after that, Artaud went through this kind of wild period where he was obsessed with achieving an initiation. He decided to destroy his own name, and he refused to call himself by his name. He started identifying himself with Jesus. Eventually, he manages to find a way to travel to New Mexico, and he wants to go and experience the peyote rites. And anthropologists have proven this now. People have gone and they've done the trek and they've talked to the Tarahumara, but he did it. In the early 1930s, he actually traveled to Mexico, went to these indigenous peoples living in a traditional tribal society, and was initiated into the Tarahumara mysteries through the peyote rites. And when he did that, he achieved this profound realization, and he called himself after that Arto the Momo, which literally means the fool. In the second half of his life, it gets really kind of sad. He believed that an apocalypse was coming. He believed, again, he was associating himself with Jesus Christ and also with St. Peter. He walked around with this crazy staff that he would strike the walls and the ground with and cause sparks. He eventually believes that he's summoned to Ireland. He goes to Ireland with no money and he's ranting and raving. Eventually, they kick him out of Ireland because he had no money and he was just taking advantage of everyone. And on the boat home, he has a mental breakdown and he gets tossed into an insane asylum. And because he refused to tell anyone his name, he was running around saying that he was the nameless one, the reincarnation of Christ. He got lost in the system. And this is in the 40s, right at the start of World War II. So his is such a wild story, but he winds up going into these mental institutions, gets lost for several years until his mother and his friends track him down, and he had almost died. He's put through electroshock, and he describes it as a death and a rebirth. And what's wild in his writings, he talks about it was a self-imposed apocalypse, that he invoked his own transformation, and that at the end that he was Dionysus incarnate. And yeah, he winds up in the last part of his life dying as a result of entheogen overdose while trying to engage in these performances of summoning these spirits. But a wild, wild, radical figure, a surrealist, a theater performer, and a true magician, and definitely an anarchist.
Yeah, sounds like it. I don't know much about him, but have you ever heard of Otto Gross before, Snappy?
No. Who's Otto Gross? Interesting.
He was another of these heretic students of Freud, and friend of Carl Jung, and actually was a big influence on Carl Jung and Freud. But he's kind of been expunged from history because he was a wild anarchist, and instead of saying that we should repress the unconscious, he said that we should become libertine antinomians, essentially, and be sexually free. And he wanted to overcome all authoritarianism and saw that sexual repression was a big part of that. So that he has a lot in common with Wilhelm Reich in that way, who is a socialist student of Freud, but I don't know of any indication that they knew each other. I imagine that Wilhelm Reich probably did know about Otto Gross's writings because they were actually quite influential in their time, but in developing the psychoanalytic method. But it's been covered up, a lot of it, and you can't. Only recently was some of his works translated into English, but he was quite an interesting guy as well, and definitely went more in the direction of an occultist, but he was more of like a anarchist psychoanalyst. So,
oh, that's wild. I'll have to check that out. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Oscar Gross, right?
Otto Gross.
Otto Gross. Okay. Because it was wild that you mentioned Ezra Pound, because I got really, and now you're mentioning Otto Gross, because are you familiar with Hilda Doolittle, HD?
No, I'm not.
So Hilda Doolittle is another one of these modern occultists that's just been completely stricken from the record. She's most famous as a modernist poet and as an imagist. She was the muse of Ezra Pound, but she rebelled against Ezra Pound and became her own empowered woman. Really beautiful poetry and a total magician. She was also a student of Freud and a friend of, well, an enemy of Carl Jung. She thought that Freud was the master and actually rebuked Carl Jung and thought that Carl Jung was an imitator. And she actually celebrates Freud as an occultist and defended him for his against a lot of his accusations of misogyny. And she wrote a book about she stayed with him for several years getting therapy all throughout World War II and a little bit after. And there's some really, really interesting stuff there, really powerful stuff. But her best book is called Helen in Egypt, where there's all of these rumors of a play that's been lost, and it's by this guy named Ibycus, which says that Helen of Troy wasn't actually taken to Troy. Instead, it was like what happened to Iphigenia. She was transported instead to Egypt, where she became a priestess of Isis. And so this book is wild. You got to read it. There's so much cool stuff in it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, clearly, psychology cannot be separated from the occult in those early stages, especially. But it's all coming out of there. Carl Jung and Freud, obviously heavily influenced by the Greeks and others. So it's all there. It's just a matter of recognizing it. Like modern atheistic people have kind of appropriated this history and covered up key bits of it to make certain people look better than they were, or to secularize it all. But these were not, it wasn't easy to do. It's a very blurry line between secular science and the occult. So because science comes out of Hermeticism and alchemy, and so it's all, the scientific method is all based off this occult philosophy.
Humanism entirely, right? Alchemy, chemistry, all of it comes from magic.
Yeah, and the working of drugs, and ultimately Medea, and experimenting on people, even as guinea pigs, that for good or bad. So it's all there, and it just, the context has been lost because the black magicians don't want you to have the context for history. They want you to go by their definitions, their spooks, their literalist, dualist interpretations, usually. So they're drinking their own Kool-Aid in a lot of cases, and they have become the narcissists that they project onto Max Stirner or to anarchists who want freedom for everybody. So this is just because the anarchism is so intrinsic to all of these science or psychology and the occult. The non-anarchist black magicians have to destroy that context. They don't want the vulgar masses, like Eliphas Levi said, to be able to engage in this stuff. So they cover it up, and it's an ongoing culture war. Whenever somebody like Otto Gross brings anarchism into it and has some profound realization or discovery, they appropriate it for their purposes, as Freud did, or they became integrated into psychoanalysis. So it is, and at the same time, I can read Eliphas Levi and get some insights into my own worldview, or so I can counter him, or I can, argue against him. I can look up the sources that he's referring to as these evil anarchists and then learn from them as well.
Right. We don't need to throw out any of these people. We can learn and we can build upon them, right? That's the whole point of being an occultist, is the creation of the magical self and the magical framework and the path. That's the whole of the path is know thyself.
your own personal paradigm. And before we wrap up here, I just want to say Dadaism was an influence on punk rock, and punk rock is at the root of chaos magic in the modern sense. Well, besides spare, and a few, they weren't created in a vacuum, obviously, but in the new Chaos Magic book edited by Peter Carroll, they repeatedly reference punk rock and stuff. So it's not just my opinion. There's a whole genre of music called chaos punk. It's
and even industrial music, right? Like it's the ethos that is important. With industrial, they break free of even the rock and the drums that were grounding punk music, but they still have that same radical ethos of free artistic creation and in self-empowerment.
Right. So I guess what it comes down to is if you believe the ultimate reality is chaos, or if it is a orderly, objective God that reveals himself and demands conformity. And the magicians generally fall on the side of chaos, or the ineffable infinity, we might say, the unified field, or whatever, the quintessence.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas the Abrahamic religions want to imagine that they do understand the ultimate reality in very objective, purely good terms, and they are authorities on that reality or God, and everybody must submit to them. So that is the culture war in a nutshell that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. That's the polar extreme, right? But it's ultimate. Like, do you fall for the propaganda, or do you face the unknown and all of its absurdity? That's really what it is. Do you stick your head in the sand, and do you exploit those who stick their head in the sand? Or do you reject that whole paradigm altogether and walk and face reality and all its absurdity and all of its terrifying ridiculousness?
Yeah. To be an individual means you have to face alienation, and that is a scary process until you can
Absolutely.
become autonomous and comfortable in your own essence.
But we're gonna wrap up here. Oh, sorry, Rich. What'd you say?
Yeah,
sorry.
that's all. I'm done.
Okay. But we're going to wrap up here. I definitely want to do a part 3 with you, because I really want to get, we got to talk a little bit more about the situationists, and then we can get right into chaos magic proper. We got to talk about, Peter Carroll and Rob Sherwin, and we got to talk about Robert Anton Wilson, Principa Discordia. We still got to get into Hakim Bey and Peter Langford Wilson and his stuff. And then, of course, the Temple of Psychic Youth and Genesis Peorage and Lady Briar Peorage. There's so much to get into with this anarchist current. And right now, it's important, like the whole chaos kind of magic scene and the whole mystical free scene is probably, I'd say the occult is ultimately anarchist more than anything. People right now, we're in a moment where everyone is being very, everyone is aware now of the Nazis. The Nazis have lifted the mask off, but we can't let them take the occult world. And we have to reject that energy with the full intensity of our being. We have to show the alternative,
Right. So I would say, the left-hand path is white magic or gray magic, and the right-hand path of religions, these get appropriated and turned into the right-hand path of black magic theocracies. So yeah, we can apply this to basically any culture has its heretics and its magical, and we can see it all over the place, from rebellions in China by Taoists to Buddhist figures, and all over the place. So sounds great, Snappy. Thanks for having me. I look forward to talking with you again.
And so much fun. Yeah, I always learn so much from you, Rich. I'm always just amazed. Like that stuff with Eliphas Levi is just wild. It's wild, and all this spook. It seems like the egregore, the spook, this fear of propaganda seems to be the uniting thing that connects all of these desperate occult traditions.
or as Levi said, among the uniting factor is the hatred of hierarchy and authority. So
Exactly, even that, right? Perfect, even better. Wow.
So, all right.
Beautiful
Talk to you
stuff.
later, Snappy. Thanks to
All right.
everybody.
Peace and love, everyone. Take care and enjoy a goat smoking some incense. What? Why is not working? All right. Anyway, why are you not letting me? Here we go. Okay. Peace and love, everyone. Take care. What's going on?